Chapter 477. The two strong herdsmen guarding the tribal leader had participated in many wild beast hunts. Although they did not have spears and arrows, they still stood out of the formation. They first took big steps and then ran wildly to confront the lions and tigers that came out of the cages. The tigers and leopards that he had carefully raised were not ordinary prey. Their wildness was far stronger than when they were first caught. Only when they went out to hunt, they were imprisoned in cages. The rest of the time, they were kept in cages. When they killed all the livestock, when they changed cages, when they punished the shepherds who violated the rules in the tribe, they were thrown into cages. Even those horned experts with amazing strength could not withstand a few rounds of killing and biting of the tigers and leopards. For many years, only one person survived, and after that, one of his arms was bitten off. Almost at the same time, two herdsmen were pounced on by the agile tigers and leopards. Their necks were bitten and their intestines were cut open. The two beasts lowered their heads and gnawed at each other. When the limbs of the herdsmen stopped twitching, the tigers and leopards raised their heads at the same time and looked at the frightened herdsmen in the cages. Inside the tent, Abaoji saw the tragic situation and his face was full of tears. He was about to rush out and fight for his life when Su Fengnian held his head and threw him back into the tent. He then lifted the cotton blanket that was used as a curtain and rushed out. Su Fengnian did not expect this Xueqi to be so ruthless. Generally speaking, although herdsmen who crossed the border could be sentenced to death, it was true that human lives were worthless in the grassland and desert. However, it was different from Beimang's attention to the number of young men who could control horses and fight in the tribe. The grassland women's remarriage was more relaxed than the Central Plains people's etiquette, justice, integrity and shame. Every time there was a war, Beimang would spare no effort to abduct the people at the border of Liang dynasty to settle in the north. It was all because in the final analysis, the strength of the big and small Xueqi was measured by the number of horses and heads. Generally speaking, when a tribe raised a flag to betray the tribe and chose to migrate, as long as the tribe had enough strength and was not afraid to be the enemy of the previous Xueqi, most of them would be willing to accept them. Huyen Guanin's tribe was thousands of miles away, and the original Xueqi was destined to be out of reach. For any Xueqi who did not lack water and grass, it was a fortune. It was nothing more than spending some money to bribe the superior official who was in charge of the nomadic household registration. It was equivalent to having more than 30 more tent tax sources. Su Fengnian did not expect that the Xueqi who came after hearing the news and met with the herdsmen would want to use blood to establish their power. The handsome young man with the sword and saber at his waist raised his eyebrows. The old man in the brocade robe was about to speak when the young man shook his chin, indicating that there was no need to pay attention to him. Su Fengnian tiptoed and jumped over the cavalry's head. When he landed, he happened to be in front of the old patriarch. The fierce tiger opened its bloody mouth. Su Fengnian did not care about the tiger's claws that were blocked by the big yellow court mirage. He grabbed the upper and lower jaws of the tiger with both hands and gently tore it in half. He threw it in front of him. Splitting tigers and leopards was nothing more than this. The only remaining leopard suddenly stopped. It was obvious that it felt a huge sense of danger and did not dare to rush forward rashly. Xueqi was furious and snorted coldly. The beast tamers and slaves began to shout and command the leopard to kill. The leopard with shiny fur finally could not hold back its restlessness. It rushed in a straight line and turned when it was 10 steps away. It jumped 5 steps to the side and pounced to the right side of the prey. Su Fengnian had comprehended the river-splitting technique from the canyon. He did not move his hands nor did he use his saber, but the prey's body was cut in half in the air. This time it was Xueqi and the cavalry's turn to be dumbfounded. The eyes of the young man in the fox fur coat brightened and the corner of his mouth twitched. It was really a surprise. The reason why the Xueqi led the troops to kill this tribe of 100 was because of the instructions of the powerful young master Tuoba. On the grasslands, perhaps there were powerful Xueqi who did not give face to the Yelu and Murong descendants, but there was absolutely no one who dared to disobey his orders. In the desert, his father's words were almost equivalent to Her Majesty's imperial edict. If it was in the Beimang army, it would be even better. The key was that the Empress had never felt that her merit was too high. She did not have the slightest suspicion of this military god, who came from the Dongxiang tribe and trusted him to the utmost. Therefore, in the northern palace, even if you were a relative of the emperor or a prince, when you met the two sons of the military god, you would have to lower your head. This young man called Young Tuoba had personally killed 600 people along the way. When did any of the Xueqi go to the Empress and say anything? There was no lack of Xueqi who personally led the horses and sent him out of the border. Young Tuoba was still holding his chin. He tilted his head and smiled. Which state of the southern dynasties are you from? Why don't you be my adopted son? You will be able to enjoy glory, splendor and wealth in this lifetime. Beimang had the custom of accepting adopted sons. It was similar to the Liang dynasty's adopted sons, but their status was usually only slightly higher than that of a servant. Of course, the adopted sons of powerful families could also bully men and seize women by flaunting the might of the emperor. Especially those big families in the Beimang palace who could wear Xianbei jade belts. The adopted sons had prominent power and countless privileges. The young man smiled and casually said, I know that you lowly people have some useless backbone. If you don't agree, after killing all these shepherds, I'll make you my first target. I'll bury you in the yellow sand, peel off your scalp, and water you with mercury. Su Fengnian didn't want to talk nonsense with him. He just said calmly, speak properly. The young man sitting cross-legged on the horse was stunned for a moment before he burst into laughter. He raised his hand to wipe away the tears from his eyes as he stared at the man with the saber in the hunting circle. Instead, he asked the brocade-robed devil beside him, when will he arrive? The old man's eyes were shining. He laughed and said, in 15 minutes. It's rare for a delicious food to come to your door. Young master, are you not going to personally take action this time? The young man curled his lips and said, I'm in a good mood today. I'm still considering whether to accept him as my adopted son or peel his skin and expose him to the sun. The old man stepped out of the line and asked, then I will play with him for a while? Young Tuoba, who didn't feel that there were many people in Beimang that he was afraid of, nodded lightly. Su Fengnian's Huangting Palace was like a flood. His figure flashed like a rainbow and pressed one hand on the forehead of the young man with the wolf hat. He pushed the young man off the horse and slid on the ground for a distance of 15 meters. Chapter 478. When Su Fengnian pressed down on the cross-legged young man wearing the fox fur coat on the horse with one hand, he was determined to blow up the head in an instant. However, the master and servant had underestimated Su Fengnian, who was traveling the grasslands. He also did not expect this rich child to have such a strong internal energy. Although it seemed that he was thrown off the horse and even thrown 50 or 60 feet away, in fact, his palm was bounced away as soon as it touched the young man's forehead. The brocade-robed old man left the horse's back and attacked Su Fengnian's head with both palms. Su Fengnian was not willing to do such a shady business of exchanging a life for a life. He could only watch helplessly as the great opportunity to capture the ringleader slipped from his hands. After throwing off the young man wearing the fox fur coat, he quickly moved to the side and pulled away from the brocade-robed retainer. The young man sitting on the ground had his wolf hat slanted. He grinned, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. He gently reached out to touch his burning forehead. He didn't hurry to get up and clicked his tongue in wonder. His body's qi flowed like dragons and snakes, concealing a profound principle. It wasn't wrong that Su Fengnian couldn't kill him in one strike. The Tuoba family dominated Beimang by tempering the body. Their foundation of martial arts was incomparably firm. This young man was brought by his father to the ice plains in the extreme north when he was young. He dug a hole to hide his qi and slept in ice all year round. Compared to the Taoist method of returning to the original from the inside out, he did the opposite and went from the outside to the inside. It could be said that the first rank had 4 realms. Among them, the diamond finger mysterious celestial phenomenon. Every time Tuoba stepped into a realm, he could be said to be the number 1 in Beimang. Like father like son. This young man who claimed to be number 2 in Beimang was also equally outstanding. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been called Little Tuoba. Fortunately, he was able to control his impatience and didn't pull out his sword. After getting up, he patted his back and for the first time, raised his hand to signal the devil in brocade to not be calculative. He laughed and said, "Not bad, not bad. With your technique, you're not far from the first rank. If you still have strength left, it'll be amazing. Whether it's scheming or ability, you've opened my eyes. When did such a talented person appear in the Southern Dynasty? Which Jia clan's direct descendant are you? Tell me. I can't bear to skin you. Just treat it as a joke. Don't mind it." After the Empress of Beimang came to the court, she exchanged and listened to the suggestions of the powerful officials in the north and south. According to the system of the Central Plains, she came up with a rough division of families. Apart from the two royal families, which were the first-class surnames, there were 10 families named A, which were known as the surnames Fufu and Zhuaran. The 3 families in the southern dynasty were all ancient and powerful families in the aristocratic group in Longguan. These 3 families were the leaders who controlled the government of the southern dynasty. Little Tuoba, who was wearing a wolf hat and fox fur coat, naturally thought that this hidden figure of the southern dynasty was a direct descendant of the 3 great clans. Including the 32 people of the first class from the 2 dynasties, there were 18 people on the list of Beimang. This was enough to make the Liang dynasty, which boasted of its outstanding people, blush with shame. Fortunately, Wang Xianji and Dong Tai occupied 2 of the top 3 positions, which saved a lot of face. Apart from his father, the 4 gods and demons, Hong Jingyan, Luo Yang, and Murong Baoding, as well as the state preceptor, Immortal Qilin, the 5 great clans of Mount Tibing Chess and Sword Music School had 6 positions. Apart from Luo Yang, whose position overlapped with Xialing's, and the dead Xialing, 5 of the 8 notorious diabolism giants were on the list. Together with the 2 rising stars, Yelu Dongchuang and Murong Long Xueqi, there were 18 people in total. The 6 celestial disciples of Immortal Qilin of the Tao sect were all at the bottleneck of the first class. Taoist Zhenren often reached the first class and were only 1 step away from the first class. Little Tuoba couldn't help but be curious about the man in front of him. He was only a few years older than him and was able to cross the threshold of the second class at such a young age. The second class was called the Master Realm. It wasn't like cabbages that could be planted in autumn and harvested in winter. His father once said that there were too many geniuses in the Liang dynasty who had the potential to reach the top. The current situation where Beimang had the upper hand might not last long. Su Fengnian smiled. It's just a small family, not worth mentioning. The young man in the fox fur coat nodded regretfully. He jumped up and gave little Tuoba a taste of his own medicine. He suddenly pulled out his blade and chopped down. The blade was no different from a normal cavalry. However, when it was in his hand it was shocking. The old man in the brocade robe had his hands in his sleeves. He looked like he was watching the battle with squinted eyes. However, his footsteps were light as little Tuoba attacked. Su Fengnian took a few steps back. His left palm slapped on the handle of the spring thunder blade. He swung the blade backwards and drew an arc. After barely dodging the blade, he flicked his finger and the spring thunder turned around and left the battlefield. Almost instantly, Su Fengnian's body leaned back and dodged the second blade. Little Tuoba also dodged the spring thunder that was behind him. He took a few steps forward and the third blade was raised. Su Fengnian's body returned to a standing position. He flicked his finger and the spring thunder continued to spin around. The scabbard and the blade clashed together. The young man in the fox fur coat laughed evilly. He held the blade with one hand and changed it to 2. His strength increased explosively. He was used to seeing experts fight since he was young. Naturally, he had the ability to see things from a strategic perspective. He wanted to cut off this weird blade's chi pattern so that this fellow couldn't continue to act mysterious. Just when he was confident that he could cut off the chi pattern, Su Fengnian moved forward. He didn't care about the spring thunder blade. He passed by him and pushed his palm towards the young man's forehead. The young man in the fox fur coat didn't fight according to common sense. His hands didn't change the trajectory of the blade, nor did he reduce his strength. Instead of dodging, he swung his head forward. Su Fengnian's face was expressionless. He didn't touch the young man's forehead with his palm. Instead, he touched the young man's face. He raised his wrist and held the young man's chin. His arm and sleeve were filled with chi. He suddenly pushed his arm and sleeve upwards. The young man who was still holding the blade with both hands fell down. Su Fengnian raised his leg and kicked towards the young man's chest. The young man in the fox fur coat shrunk his chest and removed most of the force. He still slid far away after landing on the ground. The blade in his hands cut a crack on the ground. Chapter 479. Blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. He lifted his sleeve and wiped it away. Little Tuoba grinned coldly. Just now, he wanted to take the full force of the kick and deliver a heavy blow to his opponent. But after years of training by his father, he was keenly aware that if he really did that, both sides would suffer. Damn it, even if one leg was broken, he would have to pay an unbearable price of breaking his chest. He had no choice but to put away his saber and point it at the damn guy's crotch. If he dared to ignore the consequences, he would cut off his family jewels. He made the right bet. but he still suffered a great loss. It was equivalent to taking a kick for nothing. His qi and blood were surging, which he had not enjoyed for a long time. With the brocade-robed servant on the side, the young machete man who did not draw his saber did not chase after him. Little Tuoba spat out a mouthful of blood and slowly stood up. He asked, "You are so fearless. Could it be that you have entered the first class?" Su Fengnian held the spring thunder that was not as satisfying as before. He had no time to care about the wonderful expressions of Char and the hundreds of cavalrymen. At the critical moment of life and death, he had to deal with both the young villain and the old man in brocade-robed. He could not take the time to enjoy the surprise and awe in other people's eyes. As for the life and death of the herdsman, he had to survive first before he had the right to think about it. Little Tuoba's manner changed completely. He no longer smiled. "I don't want to play with you anymore." Su Fengnian gave him one back this time. The young man in the fox fur hat did not get angry. He calmed down and changed the saber in his right hand to his left hand. After drawing his saber, there was still a good sword hanging on the right side of his waist. As a right-handed person, he was obviously ready to draw his sword at any time. Restraining his frivolity, the young man really brought a lot of surprise to Su Fengnian. After fighting seriously, the saber in his left hand was better than in his right hand. The strong wind penetrated the blade. After a few flicks, the wind brought up sand and stones, which almost pierced the mirage and reached the skin. Su Fengnian frowned and had to loosen part of his qi. He used the spring thunder as a sword. The sword aura rolled on the dragon wall. This move was secretly learned by the chess and sword music school and became a famous move. It was magnificent. Su Fengnian's body was like a fish. Although the spring thunder was out of his hand, he still controlled it. Su Fengnian's body avoided the sharp edge of the young man's saber, but the sword aura kept on increasing. It was the same move of Su Fengnian. Every time it passed, the sword aura grew bigger and bigger. It was like a snowball rolling. After 10 rounds of sword aura rolling on the dragon wall, Tao Qianji was crushed. At this moment, the young man's sword was rolling on the dragon wall countless times. Although the young man showed signs of defeat, he was always separated by a layer of window paper. Just when little Tuoba thought that he had grasped the trick, the swimming fish style that Su Fengnian learned from the herd of wild bulls no longer retreated. Instead, he slid in front of little Tuoba. He flicked away the spring thunder with one finger and grabbed the back of the saber with his left hand. When he was about to make a move, he could clearly see that the young man who was less than 20 years old was shocked. However, Su Fengnian did not beat him when he was down. Instead, he retreated without hesitation. As expected, little Tuoba, who was as good at acting as he was in martial arts, finally pulled out the famous Beimeng sword and drew a ruthless crescent moon on Su Fengnian's chest. Su Fengnian exhaled quietly. His body gently touched the ground and floated backward. The ground suddenly exploded. It was really like a sudden clap of thunder rising from the ground. A giant python with a colorful crown on its head rushed out of the ground and bit at Su Fengnian's right foot that had landed on the ground. The old man in the brocade robe did not make a move. It was actually this beast that had sneaked out of the ground that launched the sneak attack. Su Fengnian did not follow his instinct to jump up and expose the flaws of the young man in the fox fur coat and the retainer in the brocade robe. Instead, he stomped down on the giant python's mouth that was full of sharp teeth. The sharp teeth cut through the mirage and slid down 2 bloody grooves on both sides of Su Fengnian's calf. At the same time, Su Fengnian took advantage of the opportunity to stomp the head back into the ground. Su Fengnian succeeded in stomping down, suppressing the intense pain and numbness on his calf. However, when he looked at the old man in the brocade robe who had taken a step forward and then retreated, his red phoenix eyes narrowed. Finally, he did not conceal his killing intent. He knew who this sinister old man was. He was the colorful python brocade sleeve man, ranked 7th among the 10 great devils of Beimeng. This person was abandoned in the wilderness when he was young, and no one knew what he was raised by. It was unknown whether he was gifted or not, but he could understand the language of beasts since he was young. When he left the mountain when he was young, he became famous for rearing rare birds and strange beasts. However, when he was in his prime, he did not know the immensity of heaven and earth and wanted to steal a young Qilin from the forbidden area of the Dao De sect. His spine was shattered by the state preceptor of Beimeng's finger, causing him to lose all his skills. However, he was still able to make a comeback and enter the Vajra realm. In terms of martial arts prospects, It was impossible for him to advance to the mysterious finger realm. However, because he reared so many ferocious beasts, he almost did not need to personally fight against his enemies. It was impossible for his enemies to guard against him when he controlled the ferocious beasts. This was especially so when a female python with a colorful crown on her head was about to transform into a dragon. For some reason, she died before she could soar into the clouds. He cut open her abdomen and dug out her 3 eggs. The 3 young pythons were fed countless elixirs and hundreds of kinds of flesh and blood. After 20 years of unnatural maturation, their bodies were only slightly smaller than the adult female pythons. The old man in the brocade robe laughed softly and said, "The outcome has been decided." Little Tuoba glanced at Su Fengnian's calf that was bitten by the colorful python's teeth. He slowly sheathed his famed sword that could cut off hair and became cynical again. He said with regret, "What a pity. Even if a Vajra realm expert was bitten, he might be able to survive, but he would quickly become a puppet that could not move within a few hours. It seems like your luck is not too good. You still have to be buried in the sand, skinned, and poured water on your head. Fortunately, your whole body is paralyzed and you don't know the pain of being poured mercury on your head." Su Fengnian asked, "Since this old bastard is the colorful python brocade master, then you must be the youngest son of Tuoba, right?" Little Tuoba waved his mang saber and nodded. "Tuoba Chun's son." Su Fengnian replied indifferently again and continued, "Spring bamboo shoots? They are not as delicious as winter bamboo shoots." Tuoba Chun's son held his stomach and laughed out loud. He was in a good mood. He quite liked this kind of unfunny joke. When he heard it before he killed someone, it was just like when he had lost his appetite and came across a plate of good food that looked, smelled, and tasted good. It was the best way to eat. However, in the next moment, he couldn't laugh anymore. Chapter 480. The rainbow-crowned python was a rare and ferocious creature. Not only was its skin invulnerable to weapons, it also had the strength of a dragon and elephant. Who knew how many martial artists had died under its coiling body? However, Su Fengnian didn't know that the rainbow python's sharp teeth were so venomous that even a Vajra physique would lose consciousness. There were pros and cons to each step. At this moment, little Tuoba and the demon in brocade sleeves were confident in their victory. Su Fengnian, who had been concealing his qi activity all this time, didn't hesitate to open the golden chamber and charge straight towards the demon in brocade sleeves. He looked like he was going to destroy both jade and common stone. Little Tuoba was unperturbed and didn't have the slightest intention of making a move. On the other hand, the demon in brocade sleeves' pupils contracted. The soil beneath his feet exploded and the rainbow python broke out of the ground once again. The demon in brocade sleeves stood tall on the head of the rainbow python that was as large as a millstone. Looking down from above, the demon in brocade sleeves' chi activity boiled all over his body as he prepared to use the rainbow python's strength to block the final blow from this descendant of the southern dynasty. After taking 5 steps, Su Fengnian suddenly stopped and staggered. The demon in brocade sleeves relaxed and sneered. The rainbow python had swallowed countless poisons, and the miasma it spat out could make an ordinary person faint and die. Even if you were Vajra realm expert, if you were cut by its sharp teeth and the poison seeped into your meridians, the more you circulated your qi activity, the deeper the poison would go into your acupoints and bones. Su Fengnian only paused for a moment, which should have been an obvious sign of exhaustion. The old man in brocade robes relaxed a little at the same time. Little Tuoba, who had superb acting skills, shouted a warning for no reason. The colorful python-embroidered sleeves saw the man with the saber slide to the front of the colorful python in the blink of an eye like a fish. Taking advantage of the blind spot under the colorful python head-raising lamp, he made an unknown turn and then disappeared without a trace. The devil, who was not good at hand-to-hand combat, knew that the situation was not good. Su Fengnian, who had been twisting and turning in the narrow space among the herd of wild oxen, appeared behind the devil in brocade robes out of thin air and was about to slap the old bastard's back with his palm. This steel-crushing style was taken from a secret manual in the Tide Listening Pavilion's martial library. It had the aura of subduing dragons and tigers. When he practiced the saber on Mount Wudong, the secret manuals and ancient manuals he brought to the mountain were mostly sword and saber moves. Later, when he rushed to Bei Mang, because he needed to cultivate his will, he made a last-minute effort to learn from others' strong points. He no longer restricted himself to sabers and swords, picking up some of the best moves from the 18 types of martial arts. With this steel-crushing hand, no matter how thick and heavy the steel was, it would be shattered inch by inch. After Su Fengnian landed firmly on the ground, he grinned sinisterly. He wasn't flustered and exasperated. He was just a little regretful that he wasn't able to strike to his heart's content. He didn't look at the old devil who had almost smashed the python's head off. Instead, he looked at the man who was as strong as a lion and tiger. Using the great yellow quartz ability to perceive the heaven and earth, he didn't detect the man's concealment beforehand. He could only do the same thing as when he pressed his hand on Tuoba Chunsen's forehead, and give up a great opportunity to inflict serious injuries. If it was a one-on-one battle, Su Fengnian was completely confident that he could win by slowly exhausting Xialing. But now, Tuoba and the other two were cooperating skillfully and formed a triangle with each other. He felt a little bit trapped in a death situation. Although the colorful python-embroidered sleeve master who was at the Vajra realm wasn't seriously injured, he was still frightened and broke out in cold sweat. He turned around and said sternly, "Brat, you deserve to be hacked to death." Seeing that this valiant retainer who was far stronger than the old servant in embroidered robes had arrived in time, Tuoba Chunsun was relieved. He held his broadsword and clapped his hands leisurely as he praised. "Not bad, not bad. Your acting and killing skills are first-rate. Just now, you were able to make me draw my sword in a one-on-two battle. I'm sure you still have some tricks up your sleeve. Why don't you take them all out?" Su Fengnian sneered, "If you want to pretend to be a big shot, you should at least beat me down first. Otherwise, what qualifications do you have to waste your saliva here? Interesting?" Tuoba Chunsun didn't get angry. Instead, he smiled and explained patiently, "Originally, I don't like to talk nonsense when I kill people. However, be it spring bamboo shoots or winter bamboo shoots, since there's a plate of delicious food in front of me, it's normal for a customer to praise the color, aroma, and taste before eating. This is also human nature. I'll say this first. When you're stuffed into the sand and scalped, I'll definitely talk more nonsense. If my saliva and mercury accidentally drips onto your head, please don't mind it." Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Since there's an expert embroidered sleeve master who can't even defeat a finger of Qilin's spiritual master, may I ask who this big brother who is serving as a dog for the spring bamboo shoots is?" The burly man narrowed his eyes and gave a concise reply. "Duan Bo Er Hui. I'll tear off your limbs later." Su Fengnian only stretched out a hand with his palm facing up. Tuoba Chunsun twisted his neck and walked slowly towards Su Fengnian. He said with a smile, "Let me do it. It's not easy to find such an excellent saber dummy like you. I want to play with you slowly." Tuoba Chunsun then waved his hand and ordered the horsemen who were as dumb as ants, "Xueqi, don't bother about these herdsmen. Go and open up the hunting circle. Guard the 4 directions in the north, south, east, and west. 25 horsemen will form a team. If this young master is lucky enough to escape from the circle, it doesn't matter if you use your warhorses to ram him or use your lives to fill the gap." Xueqi was really afraid that young Master Tuoba would ask him to lead the horsemen to engage in a suicidal battle. Since it was just a hunting trip, it wasn't a difficult task. Immediately, he led 100 horsemen and wandered 200 paces away. Tuoba Chunsun, the devil in embroidered robe, and Duan Bo Er all returned. They formed a tripartite formation and helped each other. They imperceptibly trapped this fish in the net and reduced the space for him to act. Tuoba Chunsun, who had the advantage of time and place, began to run faster. He dragged his saber with both hands and rushed towards Su Fengnian. The saber was constantly surrounded by purple threads, vaguely showing the demeanor of a grandmaster. Chapter 481. Tuoba Chunsun's bladesmanship was simple and plain. His bladesmanship was straightforward and there were few fancy techniques. The rhythm was clear and distinct. Obviously, it was born from the killing of battle formations. The treachery of this Baimang's heaven-titled aristocratic family's son lay in the fact that he was able to switch between one hand and both hands rapidly. Only when there was no fixed pattern or unsheathed sword would people be afraid of him. This was similar to Su Fengnian's sheathed spring thunder at his waist. However, Tuoba Chunsun's advantage was that he had the demon in brocade robe and Duan Bo Er backing him up. As long as he was not killed in one strike, he could focus on his bladesmanship without any scruples. On the other hand, Tuoba Chunsun's physique was almost unparalleled in the world. Tuoba Chunsun was in high spirits as he fought to his heart's content. His bladesmanship became more and more ferocious. It was obvious that he was using battle to nurture battle. All the elite soldiers in the world were trained this way. On the path of martial arts, There were countless people who took this path. However, ordinary martial artists did not have a terrifying family background like Tuoba Chunsan's. Once they failed miserably, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. Regardless of how bloody and cruel Tuoba Chunsan's methods were, the temperament he had tempered was in line with the martial arts of the pinnacle. Su Fengnian kept his blade sheathed but did not show any signs of pulling it out. He only swung his hands and fought barehanded with Tuoba Chunsan and his bladesmanship. Several times, he was able to seize an inch of advantage. He imitated Miss Hehe and used his hand as a blade. One time he succeeded. Just as he was about to blast this Beimang general's chi to pieces with stacked thunder, he was suddenly knocked away by the colorful python. This time he was quick-witted. His left hand cleverly moved the spring thunder at his waist. The short blade circled around his body and bounced to the side of Tuoba Chunsan's waist. Then, he was slapped on the face by Tuoba Chunsan, sending Tuoba Chunsan flying. Just as he was about to give chase and beat him while he was down, he was entangled by Duanbo Air, who was proficient in close combat, allowing Tuoba Chunsan to recover his momentum. Tuoba Chunsan looked at the young man who was not at a disadvantage in close combat with Duanbo Air. He took a deep breath and stabilized his breathing. He smiled and said, "Fun, fun, fun." Duanbo Air was ranked 6th among the top 10 of Beimang's Devil Dao. He was different from the colorful python-embroidered sleeve man who relied on external forces and the female zither player who used music to bewitch him. He relied on his own vigorous combat strength and was known as the dragon spine and bare shoulders. He was the #1 expert in close combat in the prairie. He had broken countless experts who were at the level of a nation. He fought in close combat with great force and strength. His fist aura was like a thunderclap as he dodged and shifted. His moves were not inferior to Su Fengnian's swimming fish style. If it wasn't for the fact that Tuoba Chunsan had a weapon to distance himself from such a troublesome person, it would be impossible to deal with him. Tuoba Chunsan quietly adjusted his breathing, and was not in a hurry to enter the battlefield to practice his saber. He was curious why this young man with a saber would rather engage in close combat with Duanbo Air than draw his saber. With this person's mystical ability to control the saber away from his hand and the boundless sword aura that was like a surging river, it would be easier for him to draw his saber. When Tuoba Chunsan saw this fellow and Duanbo Air punching each other's chests and taking a few steps back, he confirmed that this person was indeed in the Vajra realm. He let out a mouthful of turbid air and waved his saber. He laughed heartily and said, "Although I don't know how your Vajra realm can suppress the python's poison temporarily, I don't believe that you can exhaust the 3 of us by taking turns." Although Duanbo Air was forced back by a punch, his expression remained normal. He was a little surprised by this young man's inner strength and patience. He silently withdrew from the battlefield and left it for the young master to practice his saber. Su Fengnian stretched out his thumb and wiped away the trace of blood at the corner of his mouth. Tuoba Chunsan was using him to practice his saber. But wasn't he also using these 3 people to temper his physique and chi dynamic? Back then, Li Chungang had 300 to 400 sleeves of green snakes, so how could he be beaten up for nothing? Su Fengnian didn't dare to say that he was invincible, but if he were to say that he would exhaust his great yellow court cultivation and stamina that had stepped into the Vajra realm in a short amount of time, it would be a fantasy story. Although Su Fengnian was in a sorry state, he still cherished this opportunity. He was happy to let Tuoba Chunsan slowly play with him. However, his mouth didn't show any mercy. He laughed and said, "Fun? Back then, I told your mother the same thing. When you have a wife in the future, I'll tell her the same thing." The devil in brocade robe opened his mouth slightly and was stunned by what he said. He was really reckless. Didn't he know that the young master's mother was the woman of the #1 person in Beimang? Duanbo Air let out a sigh and was a little impressed by this young man's guts. He could still be so stubborn even when he was on the brink of death. Tuoba Chunsan had an indifferent expression as he walked into the battlefield with his saber. However, his right hand was on the hilt of his sword as he said slowly, "Since you want to die, I'll satisfy you. Let me ask you one last question. Why is your Vajra realm different from my 2 retainers?" Su Fengnian responded with a sneer and raised his hand to shake Kunlun. Tuoba Chunsan was ignored by this fellow time and time again. He was at a disadvantage and twitched his mouth. The old man in brocade robe and Duanbo Air raised their voices at the same time. They knew that the young master's good temper was gone and that he was about to start the massacre. A colorful python leaped out of the ground 10 steps in front of Su Fengnian and pounced toward him. Behind him, A huge python with a huge body that created a ditch in the grassland slid toward his back. Su Fengnian didn't care about the colorful python's sneak attack. He raised his hands and pressed them down. Kunlun could be shaken, so why would he be afraid of an evil creature that wasn't even a dragon yet? The colorful python that was pouncing toward him was twisted by his hands and slammed into it with his shoulder. When it landed on the ground, it created a huge pit. The colorful python shook its head and was severely injured. Behind him, layers of rivers were broken. 5 to 6 blood grooves appeared on the colorful python's body that was 30 feet long. It bounced into the air and struggled to its heart's content. When it landed on the ground, it was on the verge of death. The old devil in brocade robe's eyes were cold. The attacks of his 2 beloved colorful pythons were blocked as expected. Seeing that Duanbo air had closed in on him in an instant, the old devil sneered in his heart. Su Fengnian's single breath shook Kunlun and River Severing 6, and this was already his limit. After being punched in the chest by Duanbo air, the chi leaked out and formed a mirage. It was originally floating and swaying, and could not be said to be invulnerable. However, it was also broken by this brawny man who was ranked 6th among the Devil Path in terms of martial prowess. Due to the fist aura, not only did Su Fengnian's hair not flutter backward, it was pulled forward in reverse. After being smashed by the fist aura, his feet could no longer take root, and his body floated backward. Tuoba Chun's son, who had been running all the way, pulled out his sword for the second time. Strands of purple chi appeared on the blade's edge, and in an instant, it was as thick as a finger. The sword chi was a level stronger than before, and the blade slashed out an oblique cross in the air. Su Fengnian raised his arms to block. His sleeves were cut open and fresh blood flowed out. Tuoba Chun's son didn't show mercy after gaining the upper hand. With the blade and sword in his hand, he was dazzling like a bouquet of flowers. When the two finally stood in the flying dust, Tuoba Chun's son knocked his blade and sword against each other, shaking off a few drops of scarlet blood. Su Fengnian's hair was disheveled. He had a purple mark between his eyebrows as if he had opened the heavenly eye. He reached out and grabbed a strand of hair that had been cut off along with his headscarf in the air. He tied it into a knot and tied it into a headscarf. Chapter 482. Regardless of Tuoba Chun's family background or his outstanding talent, he always had the conceit of wanting the world to revolve around him. He was used to seeing people bow down to him, but when he saw this scholar of the Southern Dynasty silently tying his hair, he still couldn't suppress his fear and a burst of unprecedented jealousy. Although Tuoba Chun's son had an extreme personality that was tyrannical and bloodthirsty, his brain wasn't bad. Otherwise, he wouldn't have let Chu Cha hunt in the periphery even though he had the upper hand. He was afraid that this fish would slip through the net and escape. At this moment, as he gritted his teeth, he took 2 steps back and gently put his sword and saber back into the sheath. He said coldly, "Duanbo Erwi, you must make this kid draw his saber." The demon in brocade robe knew that once Duanbo Erwi, who was good at close combat, went all out, there would be nothing for him to do. He walked to a colorful python pet and squatted down. He took out a porcelain bottle that contained several kinds of rare venomous insects, and poured them all into the mouth of the giant python that was severely injured by Duanbo Erwi. He then turned to look at the youth with the saber. It had been a long time since he had seen someone with such hatred. Moreover, this fellow was so young. He was like an old man in his 60s lying on the bed, who envied those vigorous young men. He couldn't bear to see the young geniuses who were far ahead in the martial Tao. This time, under his intentional or unintentional guidance, he had harmed a few young experts who should have had boundless prospects. Other than dying under Tuoba Chun's hands, some became food in the colorful python's stomachs. There were also some whose limbs were torn apart by Duanbo Erwi's brute strength. None of them were spared. Today, this unfortunate youth who had become a hunting target would have an even more miserable ending. Since Duanbo Erwi was known as the dragon spine and bare arms, his limbs, knees, and shoulders were all lethal weapons. Now that he had received the young master's order, he no longer concealed himself. This burly man originally had a leopard's head and round eyes. After he revealed his ferocious appearance, experts would know that his killing intent had been aroused. His hair was the tip of his blood, and his fingers were the tip of his tendons, which could cut iron like mud. Duanbo Erwi's blood circulation and chi circulation had reached their peak. The domineering aura of a Vajra realm martial artist was on full display. Chi flowed from his tendons to his limbs. Every time he took a step, the grass would sink. His punches had no pattern. Su Fengnian's Fata Morgana, which he had constructed using the yellow quart, was like a bronze mirror that had been smashed by an iron hammer. Although it rose layer by layer like tidewater, it was still shattered layer by layer. His arms were already injured by Tuoba Chunsan's saber and sword. As he blocked the attack, his long robe was dyed red with blood. Duanbo Air turned around with a sinister smile and shouted angrily. His fist moved in a straight line, rudely breaking up the young saberman's skillful hand, and then he took a big step forward and rammed his shoulder into the saberman. Su Fengnian pressed both of his hands on his shoulders. 4 taels to 1,000 jin, but he also diverted the force and did not lose the momentum. One person charged forward, the other slid backward. Dust rose from all directions. With every step Duanbo Air took, the ground trembled. Looking at the cold face in front of him, he used his shoulder to push his elbow, and his elbow to push his hand. The strength of the dragon and tiger penetrated his muscles and bones like iron hooks. He punched his chest, and his internal energy poured out. With a bang, the young man was blown away by the punch. His body did not fall back in a straight line, but after his feet left the ground, he slid in a full half-arc in the air before landing on the ground. His feet were like a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water, indescribably elegant. However, Duanbo Air was proficient in martial arts and killing. How could he give the young man a chance to catch his breath and climb up the tower? Taking advantage of the slight stagnation caused by the force of the arc, he calculated the right place to land and rushed forward like a wild horse galloping through a ditch. When he got close, his feet sank into the mud. His majestic body twisted like a fully drawn bow, and then he swept out a whip kick. A series of vicious movements were completed in an instant. Since the young saberman could not reach the peak of Mount Kunlun, he might as well sink his chi into his dantian and reach the yellow springs. He did not escape or evade. His feet planted firmly on the ground, and he used an incomplete Kunlun shaking style to forcefully resist this kick. This time, when they made contact, the chi of both sides were like firecrackers, and their momentum was as strong as thunder. Duanbo Air turned back his whip kick, and his body spun in midair. The second whip kick was aimed at the young man's head. Tuoba Chunsan, who had been sitting on top of the mountain and watching the tigers fight, clicked his tongue and laughed sarcastically. It really hurts. It hurts just by looking at it. The young man who was about to be whipped to death was expressionless. His body leaned backward and fell to the ground. He slapped his palm, and his body spun rapidly like a spinning top. Duanbo Air, whose whip kick missed, could retract freely. He retracted his whip kick, and took a step forward like a plow. Then he kicked the young man's waist. After the kick hit, he did not pursue the young man. Tuoba Chunsan and the old man in brocade frowned but did not say anything. Duanbo Air, who had stopped moving, had blood flowing out of his leg. It seemed like his calf had been pierced by something. He reached out to touch his neck, and it was also dripping with blood. If he had not been startled and sensed that something was wrong, with Duanbo Air's strength, that kick would have been enough to break the young man's waist and spine. Chapter 483. Su Fengnian, who had slid sideways, slowly stood up and spat out a mouthful of blood. He did not expect that he would not be able to inflict a fatal wound on the demon. The sparkling and translucent swan eye was suspended in front of him while the slender ame was hanging at the front of Duanbo Air's neck when he was in a kicking posture. At this moment, the realm of sword control was not enough to surpass the speed of the blade. Other than having a large stance, there were no substantial benefits. However, it was more than enough to kill the guard at the Duck Head Green Inn. Unfortunately, Duanbo Air's 5 senses were sharp and he managed to dodge the flying ame. However, his calf was hit. With his Vajra physique, Swan Knee's sword pierced through his calf and it was not a big deal. As for the distraction of controlling the sword, Su Fengnian, who had suffered a powerful kick, was heavily injured. Duanbo Air touched the blood groove on his neck with his finger and sneered, "What a sinister method!" The demon in brocade robe's face was gloomy. He had roughly guessed the truth. He thought that the word sinister was not enough to describe this young man's ability to prick people's wrists. He turned to look at his young master who no longer had a smile on his face. He rejoiced in his misfortune. The more the little fellow who had yet to draw his blade showed off his martial prowess, the more miserable his death would be. His young master's physique was single-handedly forged by Tuoba. His young master also lived up to the expectations of the Baimang army god. He looked around Beimang and his line of sight was fixed on the 18 people on the list. Following this, he could be considered to have no one in his eyes. This time, he had suffered a setback in Dragon Waste Prefecture. With second young master Tuoba's vengeful personality, how could he not bear this grudge? Su Fengnian spat out turbid air and blood clots. He nodded and smiled. Sinister is sinister. However, two masters who are sitting steadily in the Vajra realm, and a descendant of a prestigious family, who is only one step away from the Vajra realm. The three of them ganged up on him and killed him. It was very honorable. Duanbo Air remained unmoved. All the bones in his body creaked. Tuoba Chun's son, whose eyes were burning, said, "Where did you get the sword control technique from? Tell me before you die, and I'll give you a quick death." Su Fengnian did not pay any attention to him at all. He just adjusted his breathing and recited the incantation. He meditated and nourished his Tao foundation, nourishing his qi, nourishing his spirit. The primordial yang did not leave to hide its true nature. The yellow court plant had the longevity lotus. 10,000 taels of gold would not be given to anyone. The beauty of the Taoism's great yellow court was not in harming others, but in nurturing longevity. What was longevity? Perhaps it was as illusory as the formless mirage, but the flow of qi was so fast that one would not know the mystery behind it unless they were in a life-or-death battle. Su Fengnian was secretly glad that he had practiced the Kai Shu style diligently. Under the destruction of the rolling dragon wall sword aura, the acupoints in his body seemed to have slowly opened up a blessed land, allowing him to freely choose the treasures. Although Su Fengnian only had 50 to 60% of the Great Yellow Courtyard, this cultivation base was really useful under the tempering of Li Chuangong's green sleeve snake sword aura. Otherwise, his body would have been badly damaged during the battle with Duanbo Air. He would not have been able to withstand a few rounds of attacks from this devil. Tuoba Chun's son asked curiously, "You've even used this sword control technique that seems to be from the Wu family's sword tomb. Other than puffing yourself up at your own cost, you haven't pulled out your blade. Do you have any other tricks up your sleeve?" Tuoba Chun's son probably knew that this cold-faced arrogant fellow would not answer. He answered his own question. "I know. You must have more than one sword control technique. How many more do you have? 2, 3, 4? Su Fengnian laughed. "I do have a few flying swords." Tuoba Chun's son laughed as well. Duanbo Air Hui, continue. Duanbo Air Hui obeyed the order to continue the fight. The momentum of his fist did not decrease, but he paid more attention to dealing with the treacherous flying sword. To Bei Mang, the earth-shattering 9 swords that broke 10,000 riders 200 years ago was deeply imprinted in the hearts of all martial artists. Therefore, he did not dare to underestimate the swordsmen of the Wu family. The sword tomb had been quiet for 200 years. The Jianghu of the Liang dynasty was no longer afraid of the Wu family, who used all the sword moves in the world. On the contrary, it was Bei Mang who still remembered it in his heart. It was indeed a great irony. Duanbo Air Hui was afraid of the elusive flying sword, so he had been carefully probing. Although he was distracted, it did not mean that his punches and kicks were not fierce enough. From the beginning to the end, he still had the advantage of suppressing his opponent with brute force. The black silk knot was like a woman's love, knotted with 1,000 threads. Su Fengnian did not understand the 7th page of the saber manual. Now that he had to try to understand it, he naturally could not understand it. When he fought with Duanbo Air Hui, he was just trying to make a Hail Mary effort. He hung the flying sword on the nodes of the black silk not according to the saber manual's embryonic form and constantly used it as a trap. Tuoba Chun's son watched patiently from the side and counted the number of flying swords. Excluding the first 2, there should be 4 more. He clicked his tongue and asked, Hey, there are already 6 swords. Have you emptied your treasury?" Su Fengnian said calmly, "Seems like there's no more left." Soon after, the 7th dawn dew appeared in the sky. Even the strong-willed Duanbo Air Hui, who was an ambitious and ruthless person of the demonic path, had the urge to curse. The dawn dew and the 6 flying swords formed a black silk knot. It was like a heavenly net that enveloped Duanbo Air Hui, greatly limiting the power of this demon. Tuoba Chun's son sneered, "Give me another one if you can." As soon as Su Fengnian said, "There's really no more left this time," he rewarded Duanbo Air Hui with a freshly made flying sword. Duanbo Air Hui was finally enraged. The flying swords left bloody wounds on this demonic path magnate's body. However, Su Fengnian was also punched and kicked several times. Every time he was hit, he would be like a kite with a broken string. When the 8th Peach Blossom Sword appeared, Duanbo Hui, whose eyes were bloodshot from all the killing, punched the young man's chest. He ignored the wounds on his body and rushed forward, tearing apart the net. The kite seemed to be drifting. However, intentionally or otherwise, it borrowed the momentum and quickly drifted toward Tuoba Chun's son. Duanbo Hui shouted, "Young master, be careful!" The old man in the brocade robe controlled a colorful python to crash into the young swordsman who refused to give up. Tuoba Chunsen's hands swiftly grabbed the hilt of his sword and saber. Su Fengnian's body rose a few feet in the air. He stepped on the colorful python's head and suddenly pointed. Unexpectedly, he did not assassinate Tuoba Chun's son. Instead, he turned toward the demon in the brocade robe. He headed north. The spring thunder finally exploded. "I have a saber." An incomparably resplendent stream of light swept across the sky. It was green with hints of purple. "Li Chungang has 2 sleeves. I have 1 sleeve. 1 sleeve of azure dragon." The stream of light swept past. The old man in the brocade robe slowly lowered his head. His body was cut in half at the waist. Chapter 484. The robe was cut in half at the waist. The robe was cut in half by the sleeve blade. It was the robe of a devil path magnate that had lived for 60 years. When the light swept out, Tuoba Chun's son squinted his eyes subconsciously, just like an ordinary person looking up at the sun. When this little Tuoba, who had been living a smooth life, opened his eyes, he only saw a corpse that had been cut in half at the waist, and the damned young man who had finally pulled out his saber. He did not know when the short saber had returned to its scabbard. With both hands on the hilt, he slowly straightened his back and turned around to face Tuoba Chun's son and Duanbo Hui. Tuoba Chun's son remained motionless like a mountain. He weighed the pros and cons in his heart. If he was the one facing that saber, he would not have been cut in half by the saber with his sword in hand, let alone killing Duanbo Hui. This was probably the shrewdness of this young man with mixed martial arts. After he knocked him down from his horse, he knew that it would not work to capture the leader of the bandits. Therefore, he set his eyes on Jin Xiaolang, who was used to riding the colorful python to fight the enemy. Duanbo Hui, who was ruthlessly plotted against, gritted his teeth and said, "Young master, this man's chest was injured by my last punch. His qi can no longer flow smoothly. He can't even ride his sword, let alone use his saber. Let me collect his corpse." Tuoba Chun's son rolled his eyes and said, "It's best if you can collect his corpse. Don't collect mine when the time comes." Duanbo Hui was furious. This time, he did not have time to flatter Tuoba Chun's son. After Su Fengnian separated from Li Chungang, he had been cultivating his will according to the sheepskin fur old man's experience in sword isolation. With the help of the divine energy brought by the purple seal golden chamber, the 1-sleeve green snake evolved from the 2-sleeve green snake finally unleashed an unimaginably fierce spirit. However, it almost exhausted all of his essence, qi, and spirit. He pulled the bow to the fullest, almost breaking the bowstring. After the spring thunder returned to its scabbard, Su Fengnian could not help but tremble, especially his hands that were holding onto his blade. His body had suffered heavy injuries from the repeated battles with Duanbo Air. His last punch had even caused him to bleed from his 7 orifices. It was just that he had forcefully suppressed it a moment ago, but now it was slowly flowing out. His face was covered in blood. In fact, when he first met Tuoba Chun's son and the colorful python man in silk sleeves, Su Fengnian was not afraid to fight, nor did he want to run. Tuoba Chun's son wanted to use battle to nurture battle and use him as a blade dummy. How could he not have such thoughts? However, man proposes, God disposes. With the addition of Duanbo Air, he sank deep into the mud, and it was difficult to escape. It was the first time that Su Fengnian heard about old godly swordsman Li nurturing the sword will. Since the sword could only be unsheathed when it was required to kill with 1 strike, otherwise the sword will would be damaged. Wouldn't that make him look like a bully? Should he use this sword when facing an opponent whose realm was higher than his? If it was not suitable for him to unsheath, how was it different from learning the dragon-slaying technique when there were no dragons in the world? However, Li Chungang kept him in suspense and did not give him an answer. He only said that he knew the 5 sacred mountains before going to the mountains. Su Fengnian entered the empty realm of the canyon again. At this moment, the spring thunder no longer rumbled. Su Fengnian slowly closed his eyes. Layers upon layers of jadeite, the sword will and the saber will were all the same. Within the sheath of the small world, the spring thunder was full of vitality. The spring thunder that came out of its body scattered across the heaven and earth. It was as if it was rushing to the sea and then back again. It even went against the current and climbed up steadily. The line between life and death brought about great enlightenment. This was a clarity that could not be brought about by reading thousands of secret manuals in the martial arts library. It was like seeing the light with one's own eyes. This was the so-called lowering one's head and climbing the mountain for 60 years. Only then did one know that there was a lamp on the summit of Mount Kunlun. Tuoba Chun's son did not dare to take the risk easily. A plan came to his mind. He looked at Chu Char, who was as cheap as an ant in his eyes. He waved at the horsemen who were already scared out of their wits and said with a smile, "Go, distribute 20 sabers to the herdsmen. Tell them that if they want to live, they have to hack this young man to death. Whether they can hack him to death or not, as long as they raise their sabers, I, Tuoba Chun's son, promise to give them 1,000 taels of gold and 10,000 cows and sheep." Chu Char's martial arts were mediocre. He only knew that the machete man was not to be trifled with. However, it was easy for him to crush a soft persimmon. He led the 20 horsemen forward and came to the herdsmen. He threw down the 20 sabers and said gloomily, "Did you hear clearly? Our Baymang god of war's young master said that as long as you raise your sabers at the thief who fled into our territory from the southern dynasty, you will be rewarded with 1,000 taels of gold, 10,000 cows and sheep. Moreover, I, the king eagle of this grassland, Chu Char, also promise you that this lake and this pasture will be given to you. If you don't know what's good for you." Chu Char did not dare to take the initiative. He quickly and carefully turned his head to look at Tuoba Chun's son. The latter made a gesture of cutting his throat with a saber. Chu Char, who received the instruction, immediately changed his expression and said sternly, "It's death." Tuoba's youngest son? Hu Yenbao's heart was as dead as ashes. He saw a young herdsman moving to pick up the saber. He glared at him and said angrily, "How dare you?" Chapter 485. The herdsman only paused for a moment. When he saw his fellow tribesmen walking out of the formation, he no longer hesitated. He silently picked up the machetes with clear edges. The herdsmen's wives and children also turned their heads away, not wanting to see this scene. A Baoji rushed out of the tent and spread out his hands between the cavalry and the herdsmen with machetes. His young face was full of tears. The old chief closed his eyes and tears flowed down his face. One old and one young, 2 faces. In the moment of life and death, they were of no help. Huyen Guanyin ran to a Baoji and hugged him. He rolled to the side and avoided the furious Char. As a shady, he was the unquestionable ruler of this grassland. His ferocity soared. Even if he, an eagle, was only a chicken in the eyes of the Tuoba family, he was not someone the herdsman could go against. He pulled out a long and forged machete and slashed down viciously. Huyen Guanyin's arm was cut so deep that the bone could be seen. Su Fengnian opened his eyes and bent down. The spring thunder spun in his hand. His back was facing the herdsman with machetes. His state of mind was as calm as an ancient well. He had seen too many ugly people and was not surprised. Moreover, for the sake of the tribe and the lives of his loved ones, it was reasonable for him to raise his machete or refuse. He held the spring thunder in one hand and raised his arm with the other. Suddenly, the river behind him broke and a gully appeared. The herdsman's charging formation showed a timid commotion and stagnation. Looking from afar, they could only see dust flying. After all, it was not as shocking as seeing it with their own eyes. The reason why they raised their machetes was not only because they were afraid of the Tuoba family's reputation, but also because they were lucky that this young scholar had a bodhisattva's heart. However, after the grasslands split, it seemed to draw a line between life and death. If they crossed it, they would also die. Thus, their lucky mentality was swept away and their courage weakened. Su Fengnian stared at Tuoba Chun's son. He stretched out his hand and smoothed out the creases on his chest that were soaked in blood. He smiled and said, "Without the colorful python man holding you back, it won't be easy to stop me again. Why don't you and I hunt each other?" Tuoba Chun's son let out a wild laugh, which made his handsome face twist a little. Pointing at Su Fengnian, he said, "There is a saying in the Central Plains that goes like this: an arrow at the end of its flight cannot pierce through the silk cloth, and an arrow at the end of its flight cannot float a goose feather. You think you can negotiate with me with your half-dead appearance?" Do you feel pain in your lungs when you breathe? Do you think Duan Boer's punch was embroidery? Su Fengnian said, how many times can I ride my sword? Have you guessed it before? Similarly, since there was a first strike, why couldn't there be a second or third strike? It's not like I can't drag another one down with me. Killing Duan Boer, who is ranked 6th among the evil sects, doesn't seem to be as profitable as killing the youngest son of the war god. Tuoba Chun's son stretched out a finger and shook it a few times. He smiled confidently and said, don't try to scare me. It's useless. I grew up being beaten and scolded by this Tuoba you keep talking about. I'm not scared. I know a little about your temperament. If you can kill someone, you won't talk nonsense. Now that you are talking too much, it proves that you have exhausted all your tricks. Qu'est-ce? Exhausted all your tricks. That's a good saying. Since you are a descendant of the southern dynasty's Xueqi family, you should know what I mean, right? Or should I say, you are starting to scheme in the dark again? I'll wait and see. Duan Bo, do it. You can have his limbs, and I'll have his head. Tuoba Chun's son narrowed his eyes and said, I didn't know it before, but after meeting you, I realized that you know some of the famous words in the books. Nagging and nagging will make you seem more emotional when you kill someone. Su Fengnian faced Duan Boer and exhaled gently. A ray of golden light rushed out of his sleeve. Tuoba Chun's son giggled and said, child's play. Your sword-controlling killing technique is worlds apart from the sword aura of one of my father's defeated opponents, the chess and sword music school. He had a frivolous expression on his face, but his eyes were cold. This flying sword that had never shown itself in the world was far superior to the 8 flying swords that were hovering in the air in terms of sword aura and speed. It was the golden strands that had formed half of the sword embryo. Tuoba Chun's son did not draw his sword. He only competed with the golden flying sword that had a tricky trajectory. He was like a passionate man teasing a girl in love, attracting bees and butterflies. The man and the flying sword were very beautiful. Su Fengnian was already facing off against Duan Bo Erwi, who was charging towards him. Duan Bo Erwi became more and more courageous as the fight went on. He was incomparably valiant, and he showed no mercy in his attacks. His entire body was wrapped in ropes, and when he moved, he could destroy mountains and shake mountains. Su Fengnian did not hide his weakness. He was determined to tear off the limbs of this young man, who dared to divert his attention to control the sword in front of him. Duan Boer's posture was relaxed. He attacked like a sledgehammer and attacked like a hook. His elbows seemed to be close to his ribs. He did not pull up much, but his explosive power was extremely frightening. The burly martial artist walked in the mud like a snake. His hands twisted and turned, creating an endless cycle of mutual generation. Su Fengnian had suffered a heavy blow earlier. Now that he had to multitask and attack at the same time, Duan Bo finally found an opening and raised his knee. When Su Fengnian's head was rebounded by a huge force, his arm swept out and his entire body was sent flying. Su Fengnian muttered softly, lend me 3,000 qi to chop off your head. The golden light exploded. The flying sword that had been hiding its strength all this while was instantly fueled by its master's desperate attempt to gain the upper hand. Its speed suddenly increased by a few times and it pierced towards Tuoba Chun's glabella. It was a close call. Tuoba Chun's son, who could not dodge in time, raised his hand to block the sword with his palm. He tilted his head and the flying sword pierced through his entire palm, leaving a bloody scar on his face. Duan Boer, who sensed the abnormality, was greatly shocked. He no longer pursued the young man who seemed to have no end to his tricks. He rushed to his young master's side, afraid that the flying sword still had a killer move. If Tuoba Chun's son, whom the military god had high hopes for, died in dragon waste state, not to mention Duan Boer, even the entire Beimang demon sect would not be enough to accompany him in death. Tuoba Chun's son did not look at his palm. He slapped Duan Boer's face and said furiously like a madman, go and kill him. The golden wisps flew in a semicircle and disappeared into his sleeve. Su Fengnian, whose face was as pale as a sheet of paper, staggered after landing on the ground. He swallowed the blood that surged up to his throat and bent his back as he ran forward. A few cavalrymen who were blocking his path were cut down along with their horses. Duan Boer turned around and chased after him. Tuoba Chun's 5 fingers formed a hook. He raised his head and roared, if I don't kill you, my surname is not Tuoba. Chapter 486. The colorful python swam around the corpse of Jin Xiaolang, occasionally lowering its huge head to gently touch it. Tuoba Chunsan's right hand was pierced by the flying sword, so he pulled out a knife with his left hand and chopped off the python's head that was caught off guard. He then slashed the retainer in Jinxiu Lang. It was more bloody and cruel than whipping a corpse. Chu Char did not dare to ride on the horse, and even after dismounting, he did not dare to get close to this young Tuoba for fear of being angered. Tuoba Chunsan chopped the loyal retainer that died because of him into pieces and glanced sideways at Chu Char. The latter trembled and knelt on the ground to beg for mercy. Tuoba Chunsan sneered, "Consider yourself lucky that you are an eagle master. Chu Char, send someone to bring all the eagles and riders of your tribe out. If you fail to kill the assassin who tried to assassinate me, your tribe can be removed from the prairie." Chu Char led the horse and trotted to Tuoba Chunsan's side. He handed over the reins and asked in a low voice, "What about these herdsmen?" Tuoba Chunsan said calmly, "The prairie is a promise. Naturally, we will give you gold, cattle, and sheep." Chu Char nodded like a chick pecking at rice and said flatteringly, "Young Prince is indeed the king eagle of the prairie." Tuoba Chunsan mounted the horse and sneered, "Whether they live or die after this is none of my business." Chu Char was stunned for a moment before he came to a realization. He crossed his arms in front of his chest and lowered his head. "Young Prince is wise." Tuoba Chunsan saw that there was nothing on the saddle and said expressionlessly, "Go get a strong bow and 3 quivers of arrows." Chu Char's lackey shouted. Immediately, there were horsemen who were extremely respectful and rushed over to hand over the bows and arrows. Tuoba Chunsan picked up an arrow with 2 fingers and shot a horseman at the periphery. The arrow went straight through his head and he fell off the horse. Only then did Tuoba Chunsan squint his eyes and nod. He raised his head to look at the yellow eagle that was trained by Chu Char. Once again, violence rose in his heart. If Jinxiu Lang did not die, with his ability to train eagles, how could Chu Char, who was once an eagle master, be a match? The great sparrow trained by that old servant could even catch and kill eagles. This kid was really lucky. Tuoba Chunsan suppressed his killing intent and squeezed the horse's belly. He ordered, "Tell that beast of yours to keep a close watch. Every time you lose track of him, I'll cut out one of your eyeballs." Jin Cha hurriedly mounted the horse and followed behind the young prince. He came and went in a hurry. The herdsmen of Hu Yenbao's tribe all felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders. For this small and weak exiled tribe, it was like the dark clouds above their heads had not dispersed, but at least it was not immediately followed by a heavy downpour. Hu Yenbao was already disheartened. He only asked his daughter-in-law to bandage Hu Guanin's wounds. Inside the tent, the young girl's body was trembling from the pain, but she still had a determined look on her face. On the other hand, the child, Abaoji, was sobbing from the heartache. He squatted on the ground and buried his head in his knees, not daring to look at his sister's wound. Hu Yenbao said guiltily, "It's all our fault for harming this young bodhisattva from the southern dynasty." Hu Guanin wanted to say something but stopped. The old man said worriedly, "The one who chased after our benefactor should be young Prince Tuoba." On the grassland, a soul-stirring hunt unfolded. After Su Fengnian broke out of the encirclement, Duanbo Air turned back and chased after him. The distance between them was gradually shortened until they were less than 300 meters apart. They could see each other clearly. The speed of their figures was not inferior to that of a warhorse. Behind Duanbo Air were Tuoba Chunsan, Xueqi, Jin Chao, and 100 riders. After casting the net, it was naturally time to reel it in. Once Su Fengnian fell into the net again, there would be no chance for him to escape. It was already shocking that he was able to kill a Vajra realm expert during the encirclement this time. Su Fengnian bent down like a leopard and did not dare to reduce his forward speed. He turned his head and took a glance at the falcon that was circling in the sky. He knew that if he slowed down his running speed, the recovery of the Great Yellow Court would naturally speed up. However, if he was entangled by Duanbo Air, he would fall into the net again. Although Tuoba Chunsan was injured by the golden strands, he still had 80 to 90% of his combat strength. On the other hand, Duanbo Air was already exhausted. It was not wrong to say that he had exhausted all his abilities. Although he did not know why his entire body was not paralyzed like what the devil in brocade robe imagined, it definitely affected his body's movements. The 8 flying swords formed green strands, the spring thunder unsheathed, the green dragon sleeve, and finally, even the golden strands of forming embryo. Duanbo Air's attacks were all solidly smashed on his body. Su Fengnian had not reached the heavenly phenomenon realm where he could borrow the heaven and earth's weather, nor was he at the earth immortal realm. If Tuoba Chun's son and Duanbo Air had given him 10 to 15 months to recuperate, he could have fought again. However, they were chasing after him urgently and wanted to eliminate him completely. Su Fengnian could only desperately breathe and heal his injuries while running forward. There was no way out. Fortunately, he had the Kai Shu-style Qi-Ji that could travel 300 miles in an instant. He was used to the stinging pain from this kind of Qi-Ji and was able to grit his teeth and endure it. Duanbo Air, who had been running madly, frowned. On one hand, he was surprised by the Qi-Ji of the Southern Dynasty's Qi-Ji. On the other hand, he was even more puzzled by the wound on his leg. When the sword pierced through, he could completely ignore it with his Vajra physique. Even if he could not recover quickly, his Qi-Ji would not be blocked like now. It could be seen that the swordsman's sword controlling technique had not reached the peak, but the flying sword itself could be considered an immortal item. This made Duanbo Air even more determined to kill this young man. As for the death of the colorful python, he did not feel any sympathy. The Tuoba family was like a large temple. A large temple would have many clay bodhisattvas. With one less bodhisattva, the rest of the bodhisattvas would have more incense offerings. Moreover, Duanbo Air had always been dissatisfied with this old servant's ranking as one of the 10 great devils. On the contrary, he admired Xie Ling and the others more. In his eyes, the old man in the brocade robe was not a devil. He was more like a laughable entertainer raised by the rich and powerful. He only knew how to use his lewd skills to seduce others. The two of them had never seen eye to eye. Duanbo Air's heroic spirit overflowed. He shouted, "Boy, do you dare to fight with me for 300 rounds?" The voice came from afar. "Call your wife or daughter over." Duanbo Air listened to the voice and discerned the Qi-Ji. This person's Qi-Ji seemed to be more vigorous than he had imagined. However, after suffering a great loss, he knew that this fellow's acting skills had reached perfection compared to his young master's. He would not be fooled so easily. Su Fengnian looked at the yellow eagle above his head again. After the time it took to burn an incense stick, Duanbo Air was shocked to find that the distance between them had narrowed to 800 feet. However, the cavalry behind him, who had been galloping in a straight line according to the falcon's instructions, had caught up. Could it be that this fellow had no sense of direction and had taken a slightly unnecessary but fatal arc? However, it was a good thing to be able to close the distance and meet up with his young master. Duanbo Air did not think too much about it. Tuoba Chun's son took the lead and rode side by side with Duanbo Air about 10 feet away. The distance between them and the dying swordsman of the Southern Dynasty was shrinking. Duanbo Air said in a low voice, "Young master, be careful of that person's flying sword." Tuoba Chun's son did not say anything. He picked up a well-made black crow feather arrow from the quiver on his back. 200 steps. Tuoba Chun's son began to draw his bow. At 120 steps, just as Tuoba Chun's son was about to shoot, the distance suddenly increased to 150 steps. Then, he kept pacing back and forth between 130 and 40 steps. Tuoba Chun's son was not in a hurry. Normally, with the guy's speed, unless it was the best warhorse, it would be impossible to catch up with him. He might as well abandon his horse and chase after him. However, since he was seriously injured, it was a different matter. He was more than happy to play with this Southern Dynasty scholar slowly to death. When the time came, he would take his head and hang it in front of his family's gate. Finally, the distance between them shortened to 120 steps. Tuoba Chun's son drew his bow and shot. An arrow pierced through the air. Tuoba Chun's son took out his quiver and picked up arrows at an astonishing speed. Although there was a sequence of arrows, they all hit the man's back at the same time. It was obvious that each arrow was faster than the previous one. This was a kind of continuous arrow technique. Su Fengnian did not want to waste any of the qi in his body. He rolled forward and dodged 2 arrows. He waved his sleeve and was about to grab the last one. Tuoba Chun's son stood on the back of his horse and drew his bow to the fullest. He shot the arrow that he had been preparing for a long time. It went straight for Su Fengnian's glabella. Su Fengnian bent his finger and flicked away the previous arrow. He leaned his head back and kept his body close to the ground. He held the arrow with both hands and did a nimble roll. He used the huge force of the arrow to continue running forward. He broke the arrow in the process and suddenly raised his qi. A small part of the arrowhead was thrown into the sky. It pierced through the body of the falcon that was flying at a low altitude. Duanbo, who was still running, was dumbfounded. Tuoba Chun's son stood on the back of his horse and clenched his fist. One of his hands was dripping with blood. Su Fengnian laughed loudly. His body suddenly accelerated and the distance between them instantly increased to 100 feet. What's the use of treating you as 3 Vajra realm martial artists? If a heavenly phenomenon realm martial artist doesn't come, I won't be able to die here. I have something to do. This is the only chapter for tonight. It will explode tomorrow. By the way, I will ask for a red note. Chapter 487. Tuoba Chun's son was different from his sickly elder brother who had been dealing with medicine all year round. Tuoba Chun's son was born with divine strength. The Tuoba clan revered martial arts and valued strength. Almost all the youths in the clan had joined the army. They had high hopes for this young master who was about to step into the Vajra realm before the age of 18. This trip was also because the Baimang military god wanted Tuoba Chun's son to break through the window paper by himself. With Tuoba Chun's stamina, his equestrian archery skills were quite outstanding. He could shoot arrows continuously for 200 steps without any deviation in his aim. However, he had weighed the remaining strength of the Southern Dynasty's rich son. Within 100 steps, it could be fatal, but within 120 steps, it could be fatal. He did not want this guy to die so easily, so he had always wanted to shoot his back at around 120 steps. It would be best if he shot his hands and feet. Every autumn hunt of the palace, Tuoba Chun's son would go hunting with the army. When he encountered large prey, he would leisurely stay at the edge of the shooting range and shoot. This was the wisdom that had been honed when his father threw him into the ice field to fight with a white bear. At that time, his only weapons were a bow, a dagger, and a quiver of arrows. This time, Duanbo was not shocked by this boy's archery skills, but he was shocked by this young man's shrewdness. Even when he was in a life-or-death situation, he still did not forget to carefully weigh the pros and cons. The group of people followed closely behind. If they disappeared from sight, they would have to rely on the yellow eagles to keep an eye on them from the sky, providing them with information. They would constantly shrink the distance between the two parties as a smokescreen. Finally, when the yellow eagles swooped down to lower their altitude, they would dodge the arrows and use the arrows to kill them. Everything was done in one go. It was as if after borrowing the chi to control the sword to injure the enemy, they had also sprinkled salt on the young master's wound. When experts exchanged blows, the outcome of the battle was often a hair's breadth away. With the yellow eagle hovering in the air, their victory was assured. Even if they were lucky enough to escape from their field of vision, as long as the general direction was correct, they were not afraid that this person would slip through the net. If they chased him all the way, they would not give him time to catch his breath and heal his injuries. Duanbo revealed a sinister smile. Since you can still kill an eagle to demonstrate your strength, I'll give you the straw that breaks the camel's back. His coarse face was dyed a sickly crimson red. His eyes were pitch black, and his irises gradually faded until his pupils could no longer be seen. Even the cavalry, including City Chichar, sensed the strangeness of the squire, and their horses became restless. Duanbo suddenly stopped his steps and made a gesture of throwing a spear. The 100 cavalrymen who were desperately riding their horses were baffled. The young prince's retainer did not have any weapons in his hands. Was he trying to take the machete man as a bird that would be frightened by the twang of a bow? As a city from the grassland, Chu Char was experienced and knowledgeable. She stole a glance at Tuoba Chun's son who was standing on the back of the horse. Tuoba Chun's son was indeed the son of the god of war. His servants were so powerful that any one of them could flatten a small tribe by themselves. Lightning Spear. This time, Duanbo had used his chi and blood to forcefully raise his realm, stepping into the spirit void false realm. He bent his arm as if he was raising a spear and stepped on a series of pleasing intersecting steps. When he threw the spear, his left leg made a subtle but decisive step, driving his forearm forward in a whipping motion. There was an ear-piercing whoosh as a spear invisible to the naked eye pierced through the air. Wherever the spear passed, there would be ripples caused by the vacuum. It was like a comet sweeping past, arcing towards Su Fengnian's back. Duanbo was born in the Chong tribe and had been good at using featherless javelins since ancient times. The javelins were slender and sharp, and those with great strength could pierce through several armors. He had participated in hunting since childhood and was known for his spear-throwing skills. When he was young, he met the great Grandmaster Spear Immortal Wuxia, who was at the peak of martial arts. He was taught the profound meaning of the spear and eventually created the lightning spear divine ability. 8 years ago, he fought with a famous demon from the devil path and killed him with 2 spears. Duanbo Air did not dare to use this kind of spear technique that consumed a lot of qi and blood. Moreover, it had the advantage of catching Su Fengyan off guard and attacking from a distance. It could be seen how much importance Duanbo Air had placed on Su Fengyan. After Su Fengyan clearly knew the identities of Tuoba Chun's son and the others, especially when he started to flee, he had been waiting for Duanbo Air to use his famous technique. The lightning spear that was known as the 3 Spears Splitting Mountains had finally arrived. Along the way, the scattered Great Yellow Courtyard, other than the broken arrows used to kill the Yellow Eagle, were all prepared to block this spear. There was no need to think about dodging. The lightning spear that was thrown out was guided by Duanbo Air's chi from afar. It was not like an arrow that had a fixed target. This was similar to the superior sword controlling technique. The mark between Su Fengyan's brows had already turned purplish black. He did not care if he was in the state of terminal lucidity. He stopped and turned around. Both of his hands twisted the spring lightning and his body flew backward. The spring lightning once again formed a huge mirror of chi wall in the valley. The conflict between the two was decided in this one move. Duanbo Air was undoubtedly still a powerful crossbow. Su Fengyan's strength had become weaker. The round mirror was shattered by the lightning spear and the spring lightning was sent flying backward. The lightning spear changed its trajectory slightly and pierced into Su Fengyan's ribs. After penetrating through, it still blasted a hole as tall as a person on the ground, causing dust to fly everywhere. Duanbo Air could be considered to have avenged Tuoba Chun's son for stabbing his palm with the flying sword. Jin Chaer and Bai Qi finally felt relieved. This guy was really too troublesome. This time, he should have accepted his fate and died, right? Su Fengyan's body fell heavily on the ground. He struggled to sit up, but he could not stand up anymore. He took the spring lightning beside him and sat down cross-legged, placing it across his knees. The blood that gushed out of his mouth had already turned black. If he did not wipe it off, it was destined that he would not be able to wipe it clean. Su Fengyan only stretched out his hand and rubbed his hair. His body, hair, and skin were all given to him by his parents. Chapter 488. Ever since he was a child, Li Yishan had joked that he looked like a rich man from the north and the south. No wonder he was reincarnated into the Su family. His eldest sister, Su Jihu, always joked that of the 4 people in the family, he looked the most like their mother. Their facial features were the same, their eyes were the same, and even their hair was the same. She always said that she was very jealous. Su Fengyan's vision blurred. His mind flashed, and he thought of many trivial things. He thought of Su Zhao's hunched back, the 4 siblings laughing and playing, the spirit-suppressing song of Prince Liang's mansion on Mount Qingliang, the white robe that had been a heavy shadow in his heart since he was a child, the old man's sword came and went, and the bloated hill on the military parade platform by the Guangling River. Too many people and too many things flashed by. He didn't know why, but when his life came to an end, he felt sorry for his father, Su Xiao, for not being able to take over the burden of 300,000 cavalrymen from him, and for not being able to ease his shoulders. In the end, he thought of a woman's dimples. Although they grew up together, they couldn't be called childhood sweethearts. He had lived for no more than 20 years, but he had already seen all kinds of women. Perhaps it was just as the head maidservant Sweet Potato had said. He appeared to be affectionate, but was actually heartless and cold. He had cared about many women, but it seemed that he could let go of any of them. Only she, no matter whether it was the 3 years of wandering about with old Huang as a stray dog, or his travels afterwards, or this trip to northern Mang, would always think of her and feel his heart ache. If the world knew that Su Fengyan, who already had the hereditary title in his hands, was going to Beimang alone, they would definitely laugh. His Royal Highness had nothing better to do. He didn't want to be the heir, so why did he have to risk his life for something? Your father had already proven that no matter how wonderful Jianghu was, in front of the cavalrymen, he could only crawl and surrender. You can just wait for the king of Bailiang to die of old age, and wear that luxurious robe of the king of Bailiang. Why not? Even if the whole world knew that Chen Jibao was a thorn in their throat and that they would most likely lose to him, even if the Su Fengyan turn a blind eye, it would only result in the loss of military power. The king of Bailiang was still the king of Bailiang, and the white-clothed war immortal was still the white-clothed war immortal. One sat in Bailiang, and the other sat on the border. The two sides were clearly separated, and the well water did not interfere with the river water. This was already enough to make people drool. Don't be discontented, and don't overestimate your capabilities. Regardless of whether you are Royal Highness or an idiot, even if you go to the Bailiang army, no matter how many military merits you accumulate, will you be able to challenge Chen Bai, who rose from the Great War of the Spring and Autumn period? You can force soldier Saint Yi Bai Kuei to death? How many years do you have to build a direct line of soldiers under Chen Jibao's nose? Taking a step back, Chen Jibao killed Great Grandmaster Wang Xiao, who was once as famous as Li Chungang in Fengdu green robe and Fu Jiang in red armor. What qualifications does Su Fengnian have to compete with him on the same stage? In the entire Liang dynasty, no one thought that he could be like the king of Bailiang and control the 300,000-strong cavalry. It was funny, but this seemed to be the reason why the middle-aged man in the capital Great Peace City allowed the eldest son of the king of Bailiang to do whatever he wanted. In such a big dynasty that ruled the spring and autumn period, there was not a single young person who was so important to the emperor. Su Fengnian's fingers trembled as he tied his loose knot. That night, Su Shao said, "Fengnian, if you die in Beimang, Bailiang will be handed over to Chen Jibao." The Bailiang army has changed its tune. This is nothing to me, Su Shao. But if you die, as your father, I can only do what your mother did when she entered the palace alone. I can't take revenge. Su Fengnian joked at that time. As a father, you are really useless. If my disappointing son dies in Beimang, you can lead the Bailiang cavalry all the way to Beimang's palace. How domineering would that be? Su Shao was silent for a long time. In the end he chuckled and said, "Father also wants to and will do that. But I'm afraid that you will really die, so I said some discouraging words to deceive you. My Su family has 300,000 cavalry. No matter what, we will destroy half of Beimang's national strength. How can father do such a domineering thing better than you?" Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Of course I won't die if I don't have to." Just thinking about it made him sullen. Su Shao, who never hit this son of his, slapped Su Fengnian's head. The general, who never believed in ghosts, actually spat a few times and jokingly scolded him, "Don't say such discouraging words." Then he muttered to himself a few times, "Children's words carry no harm." Su Fengnian replied helplessly, "You're already 20 years old. What children's words carry no harm?" Su Shao shook his head and didn't say anything else. Su Fengnian closed his eyes and put his hands on the spring thunder. He understood some things. Why did Su Shao still like to sew shoes like an old farmer? Xianyuan Jingqing should have been like Zhang Julu, knowledgeable about the world. At the very least, he could have been close to Sun Ping. But he was blocked outside the door of his family of 3, on the Mount Hui of the Xianyuan surname. Even if he became a Confucian sage, he still couldn't take half a step out. The one who rode the ox eventually went down the mountain. But what was the difference between going down the mountain and going up the mountain? Old Man Li wearing a sheepskin coat at 16 years old, King Kong at 19 years old, Xianxia at 24 years old, celestial phenomenon. Why was it that after losing his arm, he was still at the gates of hell on the river, making a few smiles and a flying sword? In the end, it was all one word. Su Fengnian thought of her dimples and stood up shakily. Even if he didn't admit it, he knew that he liked her. If he didn't like her, how could he not get tired of looking at her after so many years? He just didn't know that he liked her so much. Since he liked her but couldn't say it out loud, he shouldn't die here. After Su Fengnian opened his eyes, he wiped the blood with his sleeve and shouted with a smile, "Zhang and I like you." Tuoba Chun's son laughed coldly, but he couldn't laugh again. A young woman came over on a sword. Behind her, there was a Confucian in a green robe who was walking on the waves. The woman stood on a long sword, floating in the air in front of the guy who was in a dead end. She glared and said angrily, "Why did you call me shameless?" Chapter 489. It was a scene of a young man and a young woman reuniting after a long separation. The man fought against 3 Vajra realm experts by himself and even killed one of them. Even though he was defeated, it was still an honorable defeat. If this news spread out, it would be enough to shake Beimang. On the other hand, the beautiful woman wielded her sword out of thin air. When such a man and woman met in such a manner, except for a blind man, everyone would feel that it was rather spectacular and heartwarming. However, the woman's words seemed to be a little unfathomable. Chu Char was shocked by the woman's appearance and sword control. The 100-odd cavalrymen behind him looked at each other in dismay. How were they going to fight? Duanbo Erwi didn't wait for Tuoba Chun's son to say anything. He was furious and threw out the thunder spear for the second time. It drew a sharp arc in the sky that was filled with killing intent as it fell toward Su Fengnian's head. The white-haired Confucian in green robes was calm and composed. He landed on his tiptoes and reached out a hand, gently grabbing the thunder spear that was shaking the air. He clenched his 5 fingers and broke the thunder spear into 2 with ease. It was like a child throwing a stone that was casually bounced away by a strong young man. Tuoba Chunsan's face turned gloomy. After Duanbo Erwi deflected the 2 spears, his chi and blood were surging. When he saw the gaze of his young master, he felt bitter. He took a deep breath and was ready to throw out another spear to check the situation of the old scholar. However, when this devil didn't care about his internal injuries and raised his chi activity, Tuoba Chun's son saw the middle-aged scholar in Southern Dynasty's attire waving his sleeve. The wind and clouds in heaven and earth changed as he waved his sleeve like a dragon. Duanbo Erwi's chi activity was like a battlement that was hit by a huge rock that weighed 1,000 kilograms. He staggered a few steps back and spat out a mouthful of blood. His chi was extremely chaotic. Duanbo Erwi was indeed a loyal servant. He shouted in exasperation, "Young master, leave quickly. Don't bother about me." Tuoba Chunsan's feet were rooted to the ground, and his body didn't move an inch. It wasn't that he didn't want to leave, but it was as if he was wrapped in endless strands of fate and couldn't move. After the middle-aged scholar kept his sleeve, he said lightly, "I'm Chao Chongqing from West Chu. Many years ago, I took in this disciple, Xueqi, in Beimang's Southern Dynasty. I don't know how you got into a situation where you won't rest until one of you is dead?" Chu Char and the group almost fell off their horses. Chao Chongqing? This was the first celestial being who entered Liang Imperial Palace 3 times. If you have the ability, go show your prowess to my father. Why are you being calculative with a junior like me? Chao Zhongqing smiled and said, "Young prince, don't try to provoke me with words. If I have the chance, I will fight with Bodhisattva Tuoba. However, I believe that Deng Tea has already passed Gusai State and is heading north to the imperial tent. If I go there now, I will be suspected of taking advantage of him." Tuoba Chun's son suddenly smiled brightly and said with a cheeky smile, "Uncle Chao, you are being too serious. Among the 10 people on the martial roll, other than Wang Xianji from the martial emperor city, my father respects you the most. He personally said that Chao Qingyi is the well-deserved Confucian saint in this world. I didn't know this person was Uncle Chao's disciple. If I'm rude, I hope Uncle Chao doesn't mind. No wonder this person could kill my retainer. His name is Su Qi. Congratulations to the Southern Dynasty for having a young talent who can stand shoulder to shoulder with Yelu Dongbei and Murong Longjiang." Chao Chongqing only said, "I just entered the realm of land Immortal. I'll definitely fight with Tuoba in half a year." Tuoba Chun's son was so angry that he almost vomited blood. He wanted to slap himself. The 3 sects had 2 sages, Qilin, and Buddha Dragon Tree. He was wondering why Confucianism, the most powerful sect, lacked a land immortal. And it just so happened to be Su Qi's master. Tuoba Chun's son calmed his mind, and he no longer had his cold-blooded temper and arrogance from before. He lowered his head and asked gently, "Uncle Chao, can I return to the Northern Dynasty?" The lady whose beauty could be ranked in the top 3 leaped down from the great Liang Dragon Sparrow Sword. She faced Tuoba Chun's son and said coldly, "If you want to kill him, I'll kill you." The great Liang Dragon Sparrow was intelligent. It circled around the lady like a little bird. This scene made Duan Boer shudder. How old was this lady? Was she really a sword immortal? A female sword immortal in her 20s? Tuoba Chun's son cursed this Southern Dynasty scholar with the surname Su. Not only did he have a master that made others jealous, but he also had a beauty that even he was jealous of. He quickly smiled and said, "Since I already know that Brother Su Qi is Uncle Chao's direct disciple, I won't dare to provoke you. Goodbye. When we return to the Northern Dynasty, the Tuoba clan will treat Uncle Chao and the rest with respect." Tuoba Chun's son solemnly bowed and bade farewell. Just like that, the curtain fell on the hunting expedition that was as loud as thunder and as heavy as raindrops. Su Fengnian's vision was still blurry. He was like a fish that was thrown onto the shore. He gasped for air and laughed while enduring the pain. "Little mud man, if you talk like that, Others will misunderstand that I'm living off you. Jiang and I raised her eyebrows and was about to reward him with a sword. However, she held herself back when she saw his condition. She disdained to hit him when he was down. Su Fengnian sat down. His tense heartstrings relaxed again and again. He kept vomiting blood but still controlled a flying sword to nourish his fetus. Chao Chongqing smiled and shook his head. He walked to His Royal Highness and sat down cross-legged in front of Su Fengnian. He didn't delay Su Fengnian from using the secret technique of Wu family sword tomb to nurture the flying sword. When the flying sword entered his sleeve, he tapped 16 acupoints consecutively with one finger to temporarily suppress Su Fengnian's qi dynamic. He said warmly, His Royal Highness has actually just entered the realm of Great Vajra, cultivating both Buddhism and Taoism. This is surprising and delightful. Su Fengnian, whose face was pale, frowned and smiled bitterly. Great Vajra realm? Similar to Li Xiaoxin of the two Zen temples? Chao Chongqing smiled and nodded. Even though she has just entered this realm, she's not much different from an ordinary mature Vajra realm. Su Fengnian glanced at the little mud man who had her back facing him deliberately. He asked curiously, why is she riding a sword and flying? Chao Chongqing was about to speak when Jiang and I snorted coldly as if to remind him. This official smiled and didn't explain. Chapter 490. Su Fengnian smiled and said, if I had to guess, it must be that practicing swordsmanship is too difficult and only picked the most fun and scary sword riding with old Li, right? Jiang and I turned around and said angrily, what? Even if I only know how to ride a sword, I'm still better than you. You came to Beimang alone and pretended to be a master. Without your retinue and Bailiang cavalry, you were still beaten so badly. Look, a casual sentence had revealed the truth. Chao Chongqing smiled warmly. No matter what, the princess couldn't win against this Bailiang crown prince. Su Fengnian had a chance to breathe. His complexion gradually improved and the mark between his eyebrows turned from black to dark purple. He covered his chest and asked carefully, how is old Senior Li? Chao Chongqing sighed and said, if he forced himself to hold on, he should have had 10 more years. But old Senior went with the flow and didn't care about his life. He felt that 3 or 4 years was enough to teach the princess the way of the sword. The little clay man's eyes turned red and moist. He choked and said, it's all your fault. Su Fengnian was silent. Chao Chongqing said softly, the purpose of this trip north was to contact a few people of the spring and autumn period who were born in West Chu. Before I entered Beimang, I went to Bailiang Palace and met the great general. Only then did I know that your whereabouts were leaked. I promised to kill Chen Zhibao to repay the favor, but your highness didn't agree. Later on, the great general also declined. The great general only asked me to pass a message to you. Su Fengnian smiled and said, speak. Chao Chongqing flicked his fingers and continued to treat Su Fengnian's injuries. He said, the great general wants your highness to go home early. Su Fengnian smiled bitterly and said, it's easy for you to say. Jiang and I said angrily, you asked for it. Su Fengnian glared at her, and she glared back at him. They stared at each other. Chao Chongqing pretended not to see and said, after your whereabouts were leaked, there were 2 people in Beimang who were hired to kill you. I only know one of them is a blind female zither player from the 10 Devil Path. She is just like the Korean Ren Mao of the Liang dynasty. She is the best at pointing fingers and killing Vajras. Jiang and I sneered, remember to run when you see her. Don't forget your life when you see her. Su Fengnian snapped, when men speak, women shut up. Jiang and I flew into a rage. I'll stab you to death. Su Fengnian gave him a sideways glance. That's my sword. Aren't you embarrassed? It has only been 3 days since we last met, and I have a whole new level of respect for you. Putting aside your swordsmanship, the thickness of your skin is comparable to mine. Jiang Ni's pretty face flushed red, and the great Liang dragon sparrow sword flew at an astonishing speed. Chao Chongqing felt a bit of a headache. Wasn't it a bit inappropriate for an outsider to be flirting in such a way? However, he quickly recalled His Royal Highness's even more inappropriate confession and immediately felt relieved. Enemies always meet. She hit the nail on the head. Su Fengnian laughed. Little mud man, have you gotten calluses on your hands? Let me take a look and I'll know if you've been slacking off. Jiang and I replied with His Royal Highness's catchphrase, shut up. However, compared to Su Fengnian's shut up, her momentum was much weaker. Chao Chongqing said slowly. It was the King of Bailiang who gave me the approximate route to the north, and I was able to meet His Royal Highness in time. Otherwise, I would feel guilty for the rest of my life. Su Fengnian shook his head and laughed. Congratulations to Sir for becoming a saint. Chao Chongqing said calmly. It's all thanks to the princess's calligraphy and sword control. Su Fengnian couldn't hide the surprise on his face. The little mudman snorted a few times, and his limpid eyes were obviously complacent. Su Fengnian asked, when will you leave for Gusai Prefecture of the Southern Dynasties? The green-robed Confucian who had reached the realm of Confucian Saint smiled and said, We'll have to wait until His Royal Highness recovers. The little mudman fanned the flames and said, Master, master, master. Su Fengnian smiled but didn't say anything. Chao Chongqing squinted his eyes and smiled brightly. He said, The prince is indeed a master. Facing 3 Vajra realm martial artists, you fought and killed one of them. The closed sword technique, which was born from the sword opening gate, and the 12 swords given by Dong Tai, will definitely shock the 2 Zhonghu in the future. Su Fengnian shook his head and sighed. Not to mention Elder Li and Mr. Chao, even compared to White Fox's face, he's still far behind. Not to mention there's a bull rider. Jiang and I curled his lips and said, compared to Hong Shixiang and Nangong Push, he's really shameless. Su Fengnian nodded seriously and said, if he's shameless, how can he say he likes you? You're the same. I just called out your name, and you rushed over on your sword. Jiang and I was instantly defeated and threw away his armor. His ears turned red. He wanted to say something but couldn't say a word. Chao Chongqing tactfully turned a deaf ear. Su Fengnian and Jiang and I said at the same time, I'll kill you with one sword. Jiang and I, who had been defeated again and again, hurriedly left on his sword. One sword came from the west and one sword went to the east. Only Su Fengnian and Chao Chongqing were left at the scene. Su Fengnian asked, It's okay for him to leave like this, right? Chao Chongqing smiled and said, It's okay. Everything within 100 miles is under my control. His Royal Highness can heal himself. Su Fengnian closed his eyes and concentrated. Jiang and I stood on the sword 10 miles away in one breath. Her long sleeves fluttered in the wind like a fairy. She bit her lips and was about to cry. She carelessly wiped her cheeks and said to herself, Don't cry. Chao Chongqing calmed himself down and felt a little emotional. After parting ways in the Jiangnan circuit, the princess and his uncle returned to the Old West Chu. In the beautiful mountains and limpid waters, regarding the unique cultivation method he taught her, she slacked off for 3 days to fish and 2 days to dry the net. She only diligently took care of a vegetable garden, never getting tired of it. Otherwise, she would lie on the table in her room in a daze counting copper coins. It wasn't until she saw Li Chungang who broke 2,600 armor with one sword by the Guangling River that she smiled. However, she was not interested in learning swordsmanship after that. She only put in some effort to practice her calligraphy. It was only when he said that he was going to northern Mang and might have to make a trip to the northern Liang prince's mansion that she picked up the great Liang dragonfinch and took the initiative to practice swordsmanship. After bargaining with Li Chungang for an entire day, she finally chose the most outstanding swordsmanship, imperial sword manipulation. However, the princess's temperament was really mischievous and lazy. She was afraid of heights since young. Even if she occasionally mustered up the courage to imperial sword manipulation, she would only fly a few feet above the ground. Her diligence in imperial sword manipulation increased the closer she got to northern Liang. It was only when she heard that Su Fengnian was rushing to northern Mang that she began to truly focus on imperial sword manipulation. Flying on the sword over the mountain peak. Flying on the sword across the river. Her momentum was like a rainbow. Her realm improved by leaps and bounds. Even Chao Chongqing was shocked and amazed. Chapter 491. Chao Chongqing took advantage of Su Fengnian's meditative state to take a few glances at him. There was no doubt that he had just entered the Vajra realm. Compared to when he first met him in Gongnam-do, his aura was much grander. In West Chu, he and Li Chungang had nothing to do, drinking and discussing heroes. The old god of swords had mentioned this ill-fated prince of Bailiang many times. His words were full of praise and criticism, and he had raised his future achievements to the same level as Bai Hu, Er's face at Tide Listening Pavilion and Xianxia at Mount Longhu. The old senior had praised this young man's tenacity, unlike the usual playboys. Although his martial arts talent was slightly inferior to Hong Xixiang's, he could make up for it with hard work. Moreover, he was so afraid of death that he was willing to use the stupidest method to improve his realm. The only thing he disliked was that this young man was affectionate and heartless towards women. Whenever he saw a beautiful girl, he could not help but flirt with her. His skill in defecating was superb, but he was careless in wiping his ass. He was like this to the West Chu remnant Yuxuanji and Princess Jing and Pei Nanwei, which made the old man roll his eyes. Chao Chongqing did not have a good or bad impression of this young man. However, he was able to refuse the temptation of giving away the princess in exchange for killing Chen Zhibao. Chao Chongqing had been through ups and downs in the officialdom and was already experienced in the ways of the world. He was only slightly surprised. Long-term planning was his forte. If Su Fengnian had agreed at that time, it would have been really disappointing. With the princess's stubbornness, she would not hesitate to stab this heartless man to death or never see him again for the rest of her life. Chao Chongqing was actually happy with such a situation. It was far less worrisome than the current situation. However, when the princess came riding on her sword and heard the confession of a dying man, Chao Chongqing could not help but sigh. Back then in the palace of West Chu, he entered the palace at a young age and played the jade pieces for so many years. Who was he playing for? Did she know that person? Perhaps even before she died, she only thought that this chess player was giving pointers to the emperor, right? Compared to this young man in front of him, even if he was already a Confucian saint, wasn't he inferior? Chao Chongqing turned his head and looked in the direction where the little princess, the pillar of the old West Chu, flew on her sword and sighed. She and Su Fengnian were destined to part ways. In the future, she would be forced to risk her life because of her uncle and the fate of the West Chu country. Was this why she was so lazy to practice the sword under the guise of being afraid of suffering? Chao Chongqing collected his thoughts. Seeing that Su Fengnian's qi had reached a critical point, he gently tapped his fingers to help him climb up Mount Kunlun. In this battle, his meridians were severely damaged. Even with the protection of the Great Yellow Court, which had been unique in Taoism for hundreds of years, it was not easy. Why did His Royal Highness have to do this? Chao Chongqing smiled. In his opinion, in times of chaos, wealth and honor were sought in the narrow path. In times of prosperity, one had to walk the bright path. Su Fengnian, the nobleman's son, seemed to be in the middle. He looked bright on the surface, but he was dangerous on the inside. Chao Chongqing did not have any pity for him. Since he was born into the Su family, he had to be aware of the difficulties. The princess, whose real name was Xianxia, was the same. How could she be an indifferent woman with great fortune on her back? After Su Fengnian's 3 qi revolutions, he opened his eyes and asked, "Are you really going to restore the West Chu dynasty? Is that why you came to Beimang to contact the survivors?" Chao Chongqing did not hide this. He nodded and said, "That's right. Many of the West Chu survivors are now powerful ministers of the Southern Dynasty in Beimang. Before I arrived at the border, I went to the Liang Palace and carved words on the 9 Dragons wall, revealing my identity as the princess to the world. The imperial court began to set up a literary prison. The king of Guangling also personally led troops to suppress the 6 academies. The old grand preceptor of the capital, Sun Shiji, resigned and returned to his hometown. The students of the imperial college were agitated. The left chancellor and right chancellor's pretense of affection was completely broken. The emperor of the Zhao family did not approve of the old grand preceptor's resignation, but allowed Huan Wen to resign from his position as the left chancellor and go to Guangling Taoism to be the administrator to appease the public opinion of the scholars. Su Fengnian smiled bitterly and said, "Fortunately, it's her. Otherwise, she would definitely hate you for making things difficult for her." Chao Chongqing said calmly, "No matter if the restoration of the country fails or succeeds, I will definitely apologize to the princess with my death at an appropriate time. I have to give the princess peace and stability." Su Fengnian changed the heavy topic and asked with a frown, "Why did Dong Tai go to the Northern Dynasty to provoke Tuoba?" Chao Chongqing, who was sitting upright and still, stretched out 2 fingers to stroke a lock of hair and smiled. 3 months ago, I fought with him at the ruins of the Western Wall. It was at that time that I had ascended. Dong Tai said that fighting with me was boring and wanted to go to Tuoba to ask for a beating. However, although Dong Tai said it lightly, I know that this time, he will not fight with Wang Xianji. He will only use the martial emperor city as a whetstone to sharpen his sword. This time, there will only be two results. Either he will die at the hands of Tuoba, or he will survive and become a sword immortal. Dong Tai's swordsmanship is only used to kill people. If he becomes a sword immortal, he will really have a chance to shake Wang Xianji's throne as the world's #1. Since the 12 flying swords were given to His Royal Highness, I guess when Dong Tai will stop using the peach blossom branch, the world will no longer dare to say that Wang Xianji and Tuoba can easily kill the remaining 8 people if they work together. Your Highness will continue to go deeper into Bei Mang in the future. Let's wait and see. Su Fengnian smiled and said, since you have become a saint, this statement is not valid. Chao Chongqing shook his head and said, in the eyes of the world, the saints of the 3 sects have high realms. However, when it comes to killing, they are too weak. This time, I entered the realm of Earth Immortal to build momentum for the princess. If I were to fall into the eyes of the hidden experts, I would only be a laughing stock. Su Fengnian went straight to the point and joked, Sir, you are too modest. A saint is a saint. Who dares to look down on you? If I had your realm and didn't have any status to worry about, I would also go to the palace to make a scene and embarrass the 9-5 sovereign. Chao Chongqing's finger stopped beside a strand of hair. He then folded his hands on his knees and said with a smile, if such a day really comes, Chao Chongqing will definitely go and watch. Su Fengnian smiled and said, I was just saying. Sir, don't take it seriously. Chapter 492. Chao Chongqing glanced at the vast grassland that stretched as far as the eye could see and said calmly, back in the day, there was an old man from West Chu who rushed to the frontier fortress. His horizons were broadened and he was deeply moved. This Hanlin also changed his poetry from that of a dancer to that of a scholar official. It can be seen that your Highness left Bailiang's eaves and went to Bei Mang alone. You have the foresight and boldness to establish your own family. Very good. Su Fengnian said bitterly, if teacher hadn't arrived in time, there's an 80 to 90% chance that I would have died here. Chao Chongqing stared at the young man's face and said in a low voice, do you know how many times the king of Bailiang has fallen into a life-threatening situation in his military life? Su Fengnian said softly, Su Xiao is only a second-ranked martial artist, but he likes to take the lead. He himself said that it was because of great luck that he didn't die. He also said that he actually has the ability to lead a province's military and government. It's just that he was somehow pushed to the high position of king with a different surname. Chao Chongqing said ruefully, the great general has attracted a lot of hatred and burdens for the Zhao family by becoming the king with a different surname. Do you think that the king of Zhao family doesn't want to do this? It's just that he doesn't have the national power yet. It's just like how the Empress of Bei Mang still doesn't have the national power to break through the gates of Bailiang. Su Fengnian smiled and said, teacher, I suspect that you're trying to sow discord. Chao Chongqing laughed and said, Your Highness, you and I are well aware of that. Su Fengnian smiled but didn't say anything. The two of them looked at each other in silence. Su Fengnian finally frowned and said, it's a pity that Tuoba Chun's son left alive. Although teacher has temporarily taken in a cheap disciple and raised a flag for me, with the Tuoba family's background, it won't take long to find some clues. Chao Chongqing said indifferently, the reason I saved him was to return the favor that Gong Namdu owed. From now on, I don't owe the Su family anything. Otherwise, with the enmity between the king of Bailiang and West Chu, it would be against my status if I didn't kill your highness. Su Fengnian said, we don't owe you any more. Chao Chongqing suddenly shook his head, as if he was helpless. On the other side, Jiang Ni controlled his great Liang dragon sparrow to cut through the sky and made a big circle to intercept Tuoba Chunsun's group. Seeing that Chao Zhongqing was not there, Tuoba Chun's son secretly let out a sigh of relief and said with a smile, may I know what advice you have for me? Jiang Ni said indifferently, go to hell. Tuoba Chun's son suppressed his anger and murderous intent. He was still smiling as he said innocently, Uncle Chao has magnanimously let me go. Why don't you smile and forget about the enmity? Jiang Ni jumped off the flying sword that was even more worthy of its name than Su Fengnian's. After landing on the ground, he did not waste time talking nonsense with this little Tuoba. He put his index and middle fingers together and whispered, Lin. The great Liang's dragon sparrow pierced through the sky in an instant. Its majestic aura was not inferior to Bo Er's thunder spear. Tuoba Chunsun's pupils contracted violently. He quickly took out an arrow from his quiver and shot it with his bow. The arrow hit the flying sword accurately. Not only was it bounced off, but it was also crushed by the majestic sword aura. The great Liang's dragon sparrow didn't slow down. Tuoba Chun's son, who was sitting on the horse, was defeated by the arrow. He pulled out his Mang saber and held it in front of him to block the flying sword. The Mang saber trembled slightly and was cut in half. Tuoba Chun's son lowered his head, threw away the Mang saber, and dodged off the horse. The flying sword circled back to Zhang and I, which was equivalent to drawing a complete circle. Formation. Zhang and I bent his middle finger and put it on his thumb, gently forming a seal. What a great celestial being sitting in the dark, the sword in the vast ocean. If Li Chungang saw this scene, he would definitely boast that his disciple was more worthy of the 500-year praise than him. The flying sword soared in the sky, turning and turning as it wished. The sword will was like antelope hanging from the horns, drawing a dazzling trajectory. Chu Cha-er and the others only saw young Prince Tuoba being chased in all directions like a dog that had fallen into the water, while this Zixi and the 100 cavalrymen all dismounted from their horses and crouched on the ground at the same time, afraid that they would be caught in the crossfire. Bo-er was afraid of the flying sword's speed and sharpness. He only dared to use his chi to meet the enemy, helping his young master to share the burden of the tide-like sword aura. This young woman cultivated the heavenly way of the Confucian school that Chao Chongqing taught her and the supreme way of the sword that Li Chungang painstakingly created. No one in the world could be like her, who had both a gifted foundation and an unparalleled amount of luck. Ordinary martial artists had to painstakingly climb up the stairs, looking at the mountains and sighing at their inadequacies. She was the only one who could reach the heavenly way in a single step and still recklessly waste natural resources. She would slack off from time to time and always like to be in a daze on the way to the top. However, it was precisely such a woman who did not put much effort into the way of the sword that Li Chungang recognized as a person who could still reach the peak of the way of the sword even though her way of the sword had already reached a high level. When Su Fengnian saw the little clay man returning on the flying sword in a huff, he asked Chao Chongqing softly, "She went to find trouble with Tuoba Chun's son?" Chao Guanzi smiled and nodded. Of course she didn't kill him. Tuoba Chun's son and that retainer were probably apprehensive of my existence, so they didn't fight back. Su Fengnian asked, "Mister, can you give me another 4 hours to recuperate so that I can talk to Zhang and I?" Chao Chongqing nodded expressionlessly. After 4 hours, Su Fengnian slowly exhaled a long breath with a normal expression. By the time he staggered to his feet, Chao Chongqing had already disappeared without a trace. A few miles away, Chao Chongqing grabbed the gray hair hanging down from his temples with both hands and looked at the sky with narrowed eyes. How many separations and separations could a person endure? Su Fengnian walked toward the woman whose back was facing him in the distance. She heard the approaching footsteps and sneered, "The next time we meet, it will be the time of your death." Su Fengnian stood side by side with her and looked toward the south together. He did not provoke her verbally. After so many years of bickering, she was always defeated. She said coldly, "If you dare to die in Beimang," Su Fengnian rolled his eyes and interrupted her, "I know what you want to say. You want to find my corpse and whip it to vent your anger, right?" She bit her lips and turned her head away fiercely. "It's good that you know." Su Fengnian hesitated for a moment and walked in front of her. He touched her forehead and said gently, "I will practice my saber with all my heart. You should practice your sword with all your heart. Let's make a deal. If you lose to me in the future, I won't let you go." She had originally wanted to curse him, say something about how he could beat her with his mediocre martial arts, or that she could already fly on a sword or something like that. But for some reason, just looking at him covered in blood, she felt very unfamiliar. Suddenly, her eyes turned red, and she could not hide the tears in her eyes. Su Fengnian reached out a finger and tapped on her cheek. "Dimple." Chapter 493. Zhang and I rode on his sword with his hands behind his back while Chao Guanzi, who was wearing a green robe with wide sleeves, floated in the air. Both of them were immortal figures. Even though Chao Chongqing knew that speaking now would spoil the mood, he still had his duty as a subject. There were some things that had to be said regardless of whether they were heard or not. This child Tuoba Chun's son purely used algebra to suppress and win over people's hearts, so he can only be considered to have passed the imperial examinations. However, he is Tuoba Chun's son and will most likely enlist into the army step by step in the future. Using his power to suppress people can instead increase his marks, so he can be considered to have passed the imperial examinations. However, if he were to be transferred from the military world to the imperial court, he still wouldn't be of much use. He is far inferior to Dong Zhuo, who was born in the wilderness and is smooth and slick in social relations. Princess, this time when you go to Beimang South Prefecture's capital city to receive the old officials of West Chu, young master only needs to show up once. As for the rest of the trivial matters, you can leave them to me to handle. Back then, 30 to 40% of the aristocratic families in the imperial court fled north to cross the border. Other than their selfish desire to not let the inheritance of their family line be severed, they didn't blindly cherish their lives. Many families endured humiliation for the sake of an important mission. They were all waiting for Princess. Zhang Ni, who was 3 feet above the ground on his sword, gave a soft hum of acknowledgement. This made Chao Chongqing stun for a moment. In the past, when he talked about the restoration of the dynasty with the princess, he always didn't hide his absent-mindedness. He didn't know why he had changed. In the mountain forest of Honglu Cave, where the second branch of the King's Qi of West Chu was located, nearly 60 people entered the mountain one after another and settled down. After his selection, the gathering of heroes was like a small imperial court. Among these pillars of the old West Chu, there were great talents who pretended to escape Zen and live in seclusion. There were literary giants who had supervised the Nanyue Temple from afar for 20 years, and a group of power generals who would rather be poor and live in seclusion. These years, they didn't hesitate to fake their deaths to deceive others. After seeing the princess, these loyal officials all knelt down and wept bitterly. However, the princess didn't seem to feel anything about this, which made many of the old officials rack their brains and worry at the same time. However, no one doubted that the little princess carried fate on her back. In the Battle of the Western Fortress, Yi Baikue died in battle. In the imperial city, all the important officials, including Chao Chongqing and old Grand Preceptor Sun Shiji, had seen with their own eyes His Majesty put the imperial jade seal, which was widely recognized as the most significant heirloom of the 9 kingdoms of spring and autumn, on the back of the little princess. The brilliance of the imperial jade seal, which symbolized the fate of a country, faded and dimmed. It became no different from an ordinary piece of jade and was completely transferred to her. It was the dusk of an empire that was about to collapse. The 9 courtiers knelt in the throne room together. Chao Zhongqing could still remember the ear-piercing sound of the hot jade seal burning the tender back and the bitter and desolate cries of the young princess. Jiang Ni's eyes were determined. "Uncle, I know that the reason why you became a saint and took me to the Western Wall and the Imperial Mausoleum is to secretly transfer your state and the remaining fate of West Chu to me. You don't have to hide it anymore. I will accept it all." Chao Guanzi's eyes were gentle as he softly said, "Princess, you don't need to care about the thoughts of the ministers. The princess being by our side is already the greatest grace. You don't need to pay any price. Chao Zhongqing and the old and orphans are scheming. The princess can place all her thoughts on that small vegetable garden. Su Fengnian was willing to send the princess back to West Chu. If Chao Zhongqing can't give the princess a stable life, then there's no need to revive the country." Jiang and I slowed down the speed of her sword and said softly, "He's not afraid of death. Why should I be afraid of pain? I won't count coins anymore." The official, who had unknowingly turned from a young man to an old Confucian scholar in his 50s, nodded and said with a mischievous smile, "Okay. Even if you secretly count, Chao Chongqing will only pretend that he didn't see it." Jiang and I smiled brightly, revealing 2 dimples. She clenched her fist and waved it. "Uncle, tell me about the first level of martial arts. I didn't pay attention before." Chao Chongqing smiled from the bottom of his heart. There are 4 levels of the first level: Vajra Finger, Celestial Phenomenon, and Land Immortal. The Vajra realm is derived from Buddhism's invincible golden body. Finger is the abbreviation of Taoism's Shentong. It means to ask about longevity. Celestial Phenomenon is the vast realm that we Confucians pursue. When the world isn't peaceful, it's up to the scholars to cultivate their bodies and govern the country. Whether it's writing or meritorious deeds, they have to use the vast righteousness to protest against injustice. However, most of the scholars only study to obtain scholarly honors for the emperor. They rarely study for the millions of people. As for the Land Immortal, they can travel outside their body and roam freely between heaven and earth. They can truly be unrestrained. Although the first 3 levels of the first level are named after the essence of the 3 sects, they usually don't have much to do with the people of the 3 sections. On the contrary, martial artists who pursue the path of Tao through strength step by step become the focus of attention in Jianghu. The eminent monks of Buddhism habitually cast the great Vajra, which has the characteristic of golden blood. Currently, There are only 2 or 3 monks who have become such Buddhas. As for the Taoist spiritual masters, once they enter the first level, it's finger. After Mount Wudong's flood, no one has entered the finger. The situation of the Taoist ancestral court, Mount Longhu, is slightly better, but there are only a few of them. As for the scholars, there are even fewer of them who have entered the first level. Zhang and I thought about it seriously and said, excluding the ordinary martial artists of the 3 sects, can it be understood that one must first train the body of Vajra, then enter the finger which seeks Qi? Then from the Qi to the celestial phenomenon, one can steal the fate of heaven and earth and resonate with it? If that's the case, why does the celestial phenomenon expert seem like a thief? Chao Chongqing laughed happily and nodded. Princess's words hit the nail on the head. Those who steal will be killed by those who steal the country. That's the logic. Zhang and I then remembered that her uncle was the #1 celestial phenomenon expert who occupied all 8 levels. She blushed with shame. Chao Chongqing, who was following Zhang and I, squinted his eyes and said, I once had a chessboard deduction. For 7 or 8 land immortals to appear in the world at the same time, that's already the limit of a chess game. Chapter 494. Zhang and I asked softly, will he become one of them? Chao Chongqing shook his head and sighed. It'll be difficult. Zhang and I tilted her head and asked, then what about me? Chao Chongqing said decisively, you'll definitely be one of them. Zhang and I seemed to have realized something and said angrily, he always lied to me and said that I was stupid and that my talent was mediocre. Chao Chongqing was in an extremely good mood and was no longer as old-fashioned as before. He joked, I'll stab him to death with one sword. Zhang and I instinctively used a finger to poke her own cheek and then rubbed her face with both hands. She mumbled to herself in a muffled voice. The tip of the great Liang dragon sparrow sword suddenly pointed upwards and she flew into the clouds. One person and one sword soared above the sea of clouds. Chao Chongqing looked up but she was already nowhere to be seen. He muttered to himself, what a majestic sight. Within the borders of the Old West Chu, unlike the other countries of the spring and autumn period, a pillar of clouds that connected to the heavens suddenly condensed the fate energy within a radius of 1,000 kilometers. In the imperial astronomer of Great Peace City, an old man who was observing the heavens suddenly changed his expression and hurriedly ran back to his library. Su Fengnian stood there in a daze for a long time before he finally came back to his senses and touched the relatively complete skin mask. This mask was made according to Xueqi, a descendant of a small clan in the southern dynasties. It was the most crucial part of the masks. Man's calculations were not as good as God's plans. After all, he had become enemies with Tuoba Chun's son. He was afraid that when he returned to his family and used the resources to investigate this Xueqi, Chao Chongqing's temporary cover would not last long. However, during this period of time, it was still relatively safe. Su Fengnian carefully changed the skin mask and lowered his head to look at his blood-stained and tattered clothes. He sighed heavily and had no choice but to turn around and head south. As he breathed and recuperated, he recalled the thunder spear that Bo Er had returned to him. The first spear was facing his back, so he could not see the details clearly. Later, the 2 spears that were aimed at him and Chao Chongqing were facing each other. Su Fengnian imitated the footsteps and jogged a few steps. After dozens of times, he felt that he could not grasp the main point and put it aside for the time being. After all, this was the ultimate skill of a great devil. The difficulty was not in the form, but in the knowledge of the Qi mechanism and meridians. If it could be solved so easily, it would be too worthless. Su Fengnian's eyes almost popped out of their sockets at that time. The layman only watched for the excitement while the expert watched for the knack. In the end, it was just a matter of dividing the boundaries. It was no wonder that Wang Xianji had shamelessly peeped at the fight between the masters and then used the other skills to improve her skills. Su Fengnian held the torn page of the secret manual and muttered to himself. It was hard to imagine that this was a hunting target who was fighting with his life just a moment ago. Su Fengnian held the torn page of the secret manual and muttered to himself. It was hard to imagine that this was a hunting target who was fighting with his life just a moment ago. This was all thanks to the good temperament that he had honed during his travels. Old Huang said that it was a blessing to be able to sleep and wake up. Wen Hua said that it was even more a blessing to be able to eat and poop. Su Fengnian felt that it was quite reasonable. As for the short reunion and quick parting with her, Su Fengnian did not feel too much melancholy. At this moment, he was not qualified to be sentimental. Moreover, Jiang and I was no longer the little mudman who only knew how to smash mud or bite people. Since she could ride the sword, there was no reason for him not to try his best to improve his state. The next time they met, this stupid girl would most likely be determined to stab him to death with her sword. Su Fengnian suddenly raised his head and saw a figure full of murderous intent. An old monk standing beside the inferior horse lowered his head and put his palms together. Su Fengnian smiled and forcibly dispersed his murderous intent. The old monk, who was already a Buddha in the human world, raised his head and said, "If His Royal Highness wants to vent his murderous intent, I will not fight back." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "The holy monk already has an invincible Vajra body. It makes no difference whether you fight back or not. Because of a good karma, I almost died on the grassland. Now my whole body is aching, so I won't waste my energy." The old monk said calmly, "Your Highness, you don't have to worry about the safety of the shepherd tribe. I will stay here." Su Fengnian asked, "Old abbot, are you speculating what kind of role the future king of Bailiang will play? If it doesn't suit you, do you want me to die in Beimang? You are wrong. Whether it suits me or not, it seems that I was destined to die in Tuoba Chunsan's pursuit." The old monk shook his head and said, "It is a person with great luck who has unknowingly changed the fate. It is true that there is no fixed pattern in chess. It is not my intention." Su Fengnian almost blurted out, "F*ck your mother," but he managed to hold it back. He took a deep breath and squeezed out an insincere smile and said, "Old abbot, what are you here for? Is there a good karma waiting for me?" The old monk laughed involuntarily and shook his head. "Your Highness, you are overthinking. I am here to give you a 2 Zen pill as compensation for my miscalculation." Su Fengnian did not hesitate and asked with a smile, "Let's not talk about the past. It will hurt our relationship. Old abbot, other than giving me 3, 4, 5, 6 golden elixirs, which are known as living sariras, do you have any Buddhist martial arts secret manuals?" The old monk gently withdrew his hand from the sleeve of his kasaya and said with a smile, "There is only one elixir and no secret manuals. But looking at your Highness's face, there is no big problem. It seems that you don't need the 2 Zen pills. I will not add flowers to brocade." Su Fengnian stared and trotted to the side of the Buddha. He said with a smile, "Don't, old abbot. Come, take it out and let me have a look." The old monk looked embarrassed and put his hand into his sleeve. He said with guilt, "That's strange. I think I lost it." Su Fengnian's face stiffened. He gritted his teeth and said, "Old abbot, can't you act like a master?" The old monk laughed and led the horse away. Chapter 495. When Su Fengnian and the old monk arrived at the herdsman's camp by the lake, they found that the yurts that had just been set up had been pulled out and put back on the carriage. It seemed that they were going to migrate again. The dragon tree monk who was leading the horse slowly turned to Su Fengnian and asked, "Your Highness, this is the 4th time you want to kill. Why didn't you do anything each time?" Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Since the old abbot is a holy monk, naturally he is magnanimous and can tolerate people who cannot be tolerated in the world. Didn't they say that Buddha's head is full of dung? Why are you arguing with me?" The old monk took a deep look at this vengeful young man and laughed. "Your Highness is really a petty person with a lively mind. But whether you want to kill or not is not a matter. I still want to ask your Highness to vent the anger in your heart and part on good terms." Su Fengnian did not hide this time. He put away his frivolous and impetuous expression and said calmly, "The killing intent is real, but I dare not have it. I am afraid that the old abbot will treat me as a devil that everyone wants to kill. When I return to the 2 Zen temples, the holy land of Buddhism, I will be nailed to death with just a spit. I have seen the temperament of the Taoist Zhenren. Zhao Huangchao and Zhao Xuansu are not good people, but their realms are extremely high. I really don't know how they cultivated to such realms." The old monk sighed softly. These 2 Taoist Zhenren of Dragon Tiger Mountain, in the end, they still can't let go of that surname. No wonder they strayed into the unorthodox path. Just like me, I can't keep my original heart these years. How can I resolve it if I don't insist on it? After I became the abbot, I couldn't figure out many things. After thinking about it, I still couldn't figure it out. I went to countless Taoist classics to find out. In the end, I felt that in the 24th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, Tao follows nature, was the most important. Later on, my disciple said that he wanted to see his nature clearly and attain Bodhi by himself. I also felt that it was good. When I argued with my senior brother about the two Gathas, my disciple returned from a long journey to the west and only said 8 words. Beautiful is beautiful, but not perfect. My senior brother nodded in agreement and passed away. There was also the saying of the Confucian sages, don't do evil because it's small, and don't do good because it's small. This trip to Beimang is destined to destroy the so-called Buddha realm in the eyes of the world. Su Fengnian frowned. Drop in level? The old monk smiled and nodded. Yes. Su Fengnian shook his head and said, I don't understand the epiphany and Buddhahood mentioned by the white-robed monk. The old monk smiled and said, Old monk doesn't really know how to be tactful. Otherwise, it would be more appropriate for me to speak with your highness in Buddhist language that people don't fully understand. Su Fengnian said helplessly, Old abbot, you finally have the demeanor of an expert. The old monk, who was leading the horse with one hand and holding the bamboo staff with the other, said softly, Even so, I will not give away the 2 dhyana pills. Su Fengnian wanted to say something but stopped. The old monk said softly, Why don't you ask yourself instead of Buddha? Su Fengnian smiled bitterly and put back the question about Su Xiao that he didn't dare to know the answer to. Su Fengnian then said to himself, No matter what your intentions are, since you are going to drop in level, old abbot's trip can be considered as me going to hell. The high and mighty ones can only be gilded Buddha statues and clay bodhisattvas. Only those like old abbot who are willing to walk among the common people can be considered true monks. The old monk silently reached into the sleeve of his kasaya and took out a small square wooden box. Seeing Su Fengnian's confusion, the abbot of the 2 Zen temples said seriously, I'm old, so I like to be praised. Su Fengnian silently took the wooden box. The corner of his mouth twitched and he was speechless. When the herdsmen saw Su Fengnian and the old monk coming together, they were pleasantly surprised. They were surprised that the young bodhisattva had returned, which made them feel guilty. They were happy that the Buddha had returned to the world again. For a small tribe that had suffered many disasters, it was a great psychological comfort. Huyen Guanyin and Abaoji jogged to the high and mighty bodhisattva and Buddha. She didn't know why she stopped, but the excited child broke free from her hand and ran over. Su Fengnian changed his clothes, asked for a bag of water and food, and continued north. Nanbei, don't you feel that the leaves of your peach tree of the same age are not luxuriant enough? Master, can you not trick me into going to pee and fertilize it? If that thing and mistress find out, I'll be beaten to death. You have the guts to not go to Jinding to quarrel, causing master to travel thousands of miles. If not 10 pounds of saliva, at least 8 pounds. Don't you feel guilty? I'll go and cook later. You don't seem to be smart enough. Master, just tell me what I should do. Mistress said this morning that it's not suitable to wash clothes for the next few days. Understood. Then what are you waiting for? Didn't I say I'll help you massage your back for an hour? It's only been the time it takes to burn a stick of incense. Oh. Looks like you're getting smarter. Not bad, not bad. Master. Mistress brought things down the mountain to buy rouge and powder again. A few days ago, Mistress said that there used to be many rich chivalrous men who pursued her. She even said that if she were to marry any of them, she wouldn't even blink when buying a box of rouge that cost dozens of taels of silver. It's not like now. Is that so? Yes. That's good. Master's master is coincidentally not in the temple. He has a few sets of Buddhist scriptures. Go steal them and pawn them for money. Anyway, when you return to the temple, he can bear to hit me, but he can't bear to hit you. Master, this is a violation of the precepts. You've already fallen in love with a girl and vowed not to be a Buddha. Why are you still afraid of this? Master, the weather is good. I'm going to wash clothes. Go, go, go. You're still not smart enough. The little monk ran to Duanmu Basin to get a washboard and sat on a small stool under the sun. Back in Bailiang Palace, she wore half a kilogram of red makeup on her face. His Royal Highness might have been kind and didn't want to hurt her heart, but stupid North-South really thought it looked good at that time. After that, he felt more and more that he wanted to become a Buddha. If he could burn Buddhist relics, she would be able to buy better rouge and powder. However, she had a dream. He couldn't become a Buddha now. Stupid North-South lowered his head and washed his clothes, feeling very worried. On Mount Longhu, which was as famous as the 2 Zen temples, a withered and thin young man beat down Qi Xuanzhen's black tiger. The fight shook the earth and the mountains, and then he rode the tiger down the mountain. Bailiang Palace. Tide Listening Pavilion. On a cool mountain, there was no wind or rain. Chapter 496. Li Yishan was hunched over a table on the dark and damp top floor, writing about the ups and downs of the power struggles of the past dynasties. He had already written about the current emperor and Zhang Julu. He shook his wrist and accidentally dripped a few drops of ink onto the paper. Looking at the slowly spreading ink stains, this chief advisor of the king's residence who had lived in the pavilion for 20 years suddenly felt nauseous. He hurriedly covered his mouth, picked up the wine gourd by his feet and swallowed the blood that surged up his throat with a mouthful of green ant wine. After putting down the wine gourd, his vision was blurry. The end of the scroll. Since ancient times, incapable and lazy rulers nurture powerful ministers. In this dynasty, the famous ministers assist the emperor. How strange. The few words were written crookedly and lost its usual style. Li Yishan sighed softly. He put down the hard brush and placed it on the brush holder. He spat out a mouthful of foul air mixed with the smell of wine and blood. Li Yishan casually flipped open a few books about the dynasty's geography that the 5 or 6 servant girls of Wutong Garden had recently compiled together. He put them down after a few glances. He struggled to stand, pushed open the door and walked to the corridor under the eaves. After thinking for a moment, he walked downstairs for the first time. For some reason, the white fox face also followed behind him. They walked to the first floor and out of Tide Listening Pavilion. They came to the lakeside where tens of thousands of precious koi fish were raised. The servants guarding the pavilion were shocked and immediately notified the king of Bailiang. Li Yishan stood at the edge of the pavilion, swaying. He waited until Su Xiao ran over before he sat down with difficulty. Su Xiao sat next to this nation scholar who had been called the right-hand man with Zhao Chongling back then. He put his old fox fur coat on Li Yishan and said with a frown, "Yuanying, your body cannot withstand the cold. Why did you come out of the pavilion?" Li Yishan covered his mouth and still could not stop coughing. Su Xiao hurriedly patted his back gently. The spring and autumn state scholar looked at the lake with a serene gaze and said softly, "Great General, how many years have I been with you?" Su Xiao sighed. "It's been 32 years. Back then, I was a barbarian of humble birth. Not many scholars were willing to be my subordinates. They all found it embarrassing and humiliating. Only you and the 2 rash youths from Chongling came stupidly. Back then, I felt that you two either had problems with your heads or had ill intentions. Later, I found out that I had picked up a treasure." Li Yishan retracted his hand and put it on his knee. He smiled and said softly, "General, Zhang Julu is a minister with more ambition and talent than me and Zhao Chongling. Is it tiring to have such a court opponent?" Su Xiao gently patted the back of his old partner of more than 30 years and smiled. "What's there to be afraid of with you around? In any case, I've always been the one charging and breaking through enemy lines, while you've always been the strategist. Have you ever been afraid of anyone?" Li Yishan grimaced and said, "You are such a scoundrel." Su Xiao laughed and said, "I'm just a rough person. Other than the shoe sewing that I learned from Old Song back then, I can still be considered decent. After tricking a wife back, I can't do any other delicate work." Li Yishan's smile was faint. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the sky. He slowly said, "Back then, many people urged you to be the emperor. I was one of the few who did not agree. If back then, because you listened to my nonsense, so many soldiers were bitterly disappointed and decided to retire, and many people became enemies with you, today you can scold them back." Su Xiao shook his head and said, "It is not a big matter. Also, I know that I do not have the fate of being the emperor. It has nothing to do with you." Li Yishan coughed several times and said, "Zhang Julu is very formidable. In just a few years, he has stirred up a new structure and new atmosphere in the imperial court. Although he often violates taboos and provokes criticism, it is indeed a meritorious service to the country. Moreover, there is a wise ruler overseeing the dragon throne, so he has no worries about the future. Especially in the matter of raising the border, his achievements are remarkable, making people exclaim in admiration. Several times the war between the 2 countries ended in failure, but under his arrangement on the eastern border of the 2 dynasties, the declining trend was reversed. The collapse of the border defense was gradually mended, and a large number of young and strong generals who were good at fighting were selected to go to the border to resist the enemy. What was hard to come by was persuading Gu Jiantang to add 2 assistant ministers to the Ministry of War to fill the gap in the border defense. At the time, under the old Grand Secretary's hand, They were appointed to the military academy at the border. If they were not turbid, then they were not valued, but now they were in high demand. It was enough to show the foundation of Zhang Julu, the empire's pasting master. He is a great general, but Zhang Julu is not perfect either. This purple-bearded, blue-eyed man is gentle in small matters, but in big matters he is conceited and oppressive. It can be said that if other colleagues disobey him, he will immediately be crushed. This is bound to be the root of a disaster. Presently, although the old aristocratic and powerful families no longer exist, the previous dynasty's meritorious and distinguished officials are taking turns to control the imperial court. Without a foundation, there are still two groups of scholars supporting them. And most of the leading figures of these two influential families have been forced to resign from their posts, expelled from the cabinet, or bravely retreated at the top of the stream, using the excuse of returning to their hometown to recuperate from their illness. This is why the new Right Chancellor of the Imperial College scolded him for playing the flute, pinching eyes, beating drums and playing the pipa. It's just that he scolded fiercely, but in the end he still did not understand Zhang Julu's intention. This Grand Secretary who monopolizes the power of the state clearly wants to ruin his reputation after one person's death in exchange for eternal peace. Li Yishan suddenly became spirited and his snow-white face began to turn red. He continued, "The blue-eyed man wants to see the Su family defeated in his lifetime. I, Li Yishan, am not good enough, but I am good enough to ruin some things. I have left 16 strategies to deal with it. In addition, I have also written down the 6 treatises on the governance of Bailiang, a total of 34 proposals. I have also finished writing them and left them for Fengnian." Bai Huer stood behind the two old men and remained silent. He knew that this withered state scholar was already beyond cure and did not have much time left. Su Xiao said softly, "Don't say any more." Li Yishan loosened his fist, revealing a pool of blood in his palm. He smiled and stopped coughing, but blood seeped out from the corner of his mouth. He closed his eyes in extreme exhaustion and said, "Mr. Nangong, Li Yishan has a favor to ask of you. In the future, if Fengnian is in trouble and the 300,000 cavalrymen are unable to rescue him, I implore Mr. Nangong to lend a hand." Bai Huer said in a low voice, "Don't worry, Mr. Nangong. I can't see clearly." Li Yishan, whose vision began to blur, raised his trembling arm and pointed in the air with his fingers. It was as if he had played a game of black and white chess with the young His Royal Highness in those years. There seemed to be some regret on his weathered face. He had been too strict with this child, scolding him too much and praising him too little. This man, who might have died of illness or old age, leaned his head heavily on the general sitting shoulder to shoulder and murmured, "Finally, I can have a good sleep." He would sleep and never wake up again. Life and death were both important and insignificant. Bai Huer turned his head away and could not bear to watch. Su Xiao, the king of Bailiang, only gently helped him gather the fox fur coat that was about to slip off. Chapter 497. After the previous emperor of Baimang ascended the throne, he believed he had done 4 major things. He unified the imperial tent, built more than 600 relay stations, dug wells where there was no water, and set up Red Army guards in all the military towns and cities. The present empress had usurped the throne but did not change politics. Other than continuing to work hard on these 4 matters, she also did 2 other things. She separated the military from the people. She separated the military from the people. She also set up taxes and household registration. She also set up the agriculture department and wrote the Essentials of Agriculture. The civil official system in Baimang was not as perfect as it was in the spring and autumn period and the Central Plains. The emperor had to spend a great deal of energy on every matter. Therefore, in Su Fengnian's view, wearing the dragon robe was not attractive at all. Every family had their own problems. Emperor Zhao of the Liang dynasty was even more diligent. It was said that in these years, he wrote thousands of words a day. It had to be said that this was an emperor who ruled the world, and not a scholar who pursued authorship. To say nothing of other things. Just the court meetings where he personally sat at the court door and dealt with all the major and minor matters of the 3 provinces and 6 ministries made the people who thought that an emperor only had 3 palaces and 6 courtyards fearful. It was late spring, the season of the valley rain. The heavy rain poured down on Great Peace City. Previously, the capital did not have the custom of putting up seals of the Taoist master forbidden scorpion. However, as Prime Minister Qingci Zhao Danping gained power in the capital and the people praised it, especially after the example of the emperor, the entire city had the custom of putting up seals of the forbidden scorpion in cinnabar. Normal people would go to the Taoist temple and spend a few dozen won to buy the seals. Rich families naturally had ways to get the Taoist spiritual master to personally write the seals. In the big houses, the clever old immortals in the Taoist temples of the capital would send Taoist children to deliver stack after stack of vermilion seals to their doors. This was no different from the warm tea given in the valley rain during the Qingming festival. At this time, there was still a short time before dawn. A man wearing a red python robe walked deep inside the palace. He held a few yellow talismans with red pellets that were completely different from the ordinary forbidden scorpion talismans. His other hand hung down in his sleeve, carrying an ordinary oil paper umbrella. He slowly walked through the corridors and aisles, heading towards the north gate of the Black Tortoise in the imperial palace. The man had no eyebrows or beard, only a head full of snow-white hair. 2 strands of long hair hung down in front of his bright red robe. The hand that held the talisman in his sleeve seemed to be trimmed and was as fair and slender as a woman's. However, upon closer inspection, there were countless red threads that looked like tiny snakes wriggling in the air. Although it was just a light drizzle, it was probably because they were close to the lake. After the shower, there were sounds of frogs croaking nearby. The north gate of the Black Tortoise had a drum room and a leaky room. There were diligent eunuchs on duty in each room. This eunuch in the python robe, whose hair was as white as frost, but whose face was well maintained and who looked to be middle-aged, walked without a sound, like a red cat that was hunting mice in the night. The number of eunuchs in the imperial palace who were qualified to wear the red python robe could be counted on one's fingers. In terms of official rank, they were led by a 4th-level official who was in charge of the ceremonial seal eunuch and a 4th-level official who was in charge of the ceremonial brush eunuch. The imperial palace of Graydon City was said to have 100,000 eunuchs. Although this was an exaggeration, it also showed that there were many eunuchs in the Zhao family that ruled the world. This eunuch, whose attire was enough to be called Diao Temple, came to the Black Tortoise gate and stuck a red seal with a picture of a rooster pecking at a scorpion. He didn't know how to read and naturally couldn't recognize what was written on those exquisite seals. When he entered the imperial palace at a young age, he didn't have the money to enter a school or private school. After entering the imperial palace and following his master, he was so busy that he didn't have the time to study. Later, his master became the emperor. Probably to avoid suspicion, he didn't have the inclination to study. Standing under the gate and looking at the seal personally written by Zhao Danping of Longhu Mountain, this eunuch's lips moved slightly and he said 3 words that no one could hear: ghost seal. He raised his head to look at the sky. There was going to be a heavy rain. It was a pity that the newly red peach blossoms and the newly green buds would be ruined. He silently picked up his umbrella and walked back. As the 4th watch approached, an old eunuch on duty hurriedly ran toward the drum room with a green plate with golden characters on it. Along the way, all the eunuchs, regardless of their status, had to stand sideways to show their respect. Even the eunuchs inside the room, whose doors were not closed, had to stand up when they saw the old eunuch. Eunuchs, in the eyes of the world, were shrouded in fog, and there were too many rules and regulations to pay attention to. Once, there was a great eunuch with imperial favor who bumped into an eunuch on duty and missed the night shift. That great eunuch's former supervisor had already become the head of the Imperial Horse Directorate. In private, they called each other father and son. The eunuch on duty was bitten back and beaten to death. Later, when Han Diaoxi found out, not only was this great eunuch in his prime, but even the head eunuch of the Imperial Horse Directorate was lynched and skinned alive. This was a major matter that even the officials of the imperial court were terrified of. The emperor, who was used to personally attending to matters of state and family, only laughed it off. As for the censor's accusations, which were like snowflakes falling from the sky, he dismissed them with the words, "It's a family matter." At this time, the old eunuch, who was heading toward the drum room to deliver the hour plate, was immersed in the reverence of all the eunuchs he passed. When he saw the big red python robe and white hair turn around the corner, his hair immediately stood on end. He didn't dare to stop. He only bent down and lowered his head. His large strides became small steps, but he increased his pace so that his speed didn't increase. The white-haired, red python eunuch moved his shoulders slightly. The 2 eunuchs, whose statuses were as different as heaven and earth, brushed past each other. The old eunuch didn't even dare to breathe loudly. How could he not be afraid? When the new prince, who had been left behind among the common people, entered the palace, the person behind him had killed more than 400 eunuchs who dared to talk about the prince's identity in private. Among them was the head eunuch of the guard bureau, one of the 24 yamens that he trusted. This red python eunuch with bloody hands was naturally the head of the 100,000 eunuchs. Along with the butcher Su Shao and Huang Sanjia, he was known as one of the three pests of the dynasty, the catman Han Diaosi. When the fifth watch sounded, it was also the break of dawn. Chapter 498. After the first sound of water dripping from the 9/4 room, a young eunuch with nimble legs rushed to the palace gate to report that dawn had arrived. Thousands of large red lanterns were hung up almost at the same time, illuminating the entire palace, making it bright and full of vitality. Han Diaosi walked lightly among them. When the second sound of water dripping came, he arrived in front of the emperor. After entering the room, he kept his head down. He could only see a pair of yellow and purple boots from the Imperial Clothing Administration. Excluding the color that symbolized honor, they were no different from the cotton shoes of an ordinary family. Inside the room, there was a servant waiting on the man wearing a yellow dragon robe. The man listened to the sound of rain outside the window and laughed gently. Guyu rains. All living things are clean and bright. It is a good omen. Han Diaosi bent over, his 2 strands of drooping hair almost touching the cold limestone floor. He said softly, "Reporting to your majesty, the 6th prince sent someone yesterday to deliver some tune before the rain into the palace." The man did not make a sound. The atmosphere in the room was stagnant. Only the rumbling of the rain could be heard outside the window. After a long time, he laughed and said, "Although the tune before the rain is tender like silk, it is obvious that he is giving it to you, the great master's husband. It has nothing to do with me." Han Diaosi bent even lower. The man took off a yellow and purple cotton shoe and smashed it on the body of the eunuch. He laughed loudly and said somewhat helplessly, "Just bring 3 catties." Han Diaosi in the red python robe nodded. His snow-white hair curled on the floor. He picked up the cotton shoe, trotted a few steps, and handed it to Yu Qian Jingren. He then took a few steps back and stood in place. Using the soft and gentle voice of a eunuch, he said softly, "Your Majesty, please forgive me. The 6th prince only sent 2 catties of tune." The man, who had just taken the cotton shoe and was about to put it on himself, threw it over and scolded with a smile. "Then bring the 2 catties. As the great master, you don't have the fortune to eat it." The great eunuch with the treasure seal and several red python officials were already waiting quietly outside the door, standing in the middle of the corridor. The wind blew and the rain slanted. The rain beat against the railing and splashed into the corridor, soaking the shoes very quickly. These eunuchs were all 4th-ranked eunuchs. They were waiting to follow His Majesty to the south. Along the way, they had to cross the Dragon Path, which symbolized the boundary of the great inner kingdom. Then, they had to go around 2 palaces before they could reach the so-called Golden Imperial Hall to participate in the morning court. Before the court, there would be a few newly promoted servants who would join the group midway. They were all young and new faces, but even the eunuchs had to greet them with smiles. It was completely different from when the high-ranking officials and dignitaries met them in the palace and took the initiative to get off their horses and palanquins. The morning court of the current dynasty followed the old rules. The emperor came in person. Aside from natural disasters, the severe cold and intense heat continued throughout the day. However, for most of the low-ranking officials in the capital, it wasn't too tiring. They only needed to participate in the court that was held once every 5 days, as well as the morning court. The officials who lived on the streets near the imperial city where influential officials gathered would wake up at about 4 in the morning. As for the other officials, if they couldn't afford to buy a luxurious residence close to the imperial city, the closer they were to the imperial city, the more expensive the land. They would probably have to leave in the middle of the night to not miss the court session. Today, it was raining heavily. When the civil and military officials went out, they all brought raincoats. Right now, they were waiting for the gates to open. Because it was a great court session, not only were there nobles, marquises, princes and consorts, as well as close to 1,000 officials, many hereditary meritorious officials also came to the morning court session. There were a total of 1,400 to 500 people, standing densely in the rain outside the imperial city gates. The soybean-sized raindrops struck against the surface of the umbrellas, releasing pong-pong noises. This was a scene unique to a peaceful and prosperous era, waiting for the court to leak out. This was a massive empire unprecedented in history. Countless government orders were handed down to them to pass down to every corner of the territory. After the bell rang, these officials who held great power in their hands had to abandon their umbrellas and move forward. After passing through the city gates, they weren't allowed to make any noise or spit. Only after Grand Secretary Zhang took over the reins of power was this type of bad habit washed away, each court session becoming increasingly solemn and dignified. Once a low-ranked minor official was discovered, they would naturally be chased out by the imperial guards and eunuchs. In the past, many children of meritorious officials also didn't pay this type of matter any attention. Before stepping into the palace, they would always whisper with family friends, saying some disrespectful words. Only after Grand Secretary Zhang took over power was this type of bad habit washed away, each court session becoming more and more solemn and dignified. Great Yellow Gate Jean Lanting stood with an umbrella, still all alone. Most of the capital's officials who didn't like this person all privately mocked him for being a crane standing out from a flock of chickens, but rather a chicken standing out from a flock of cranes. This was especially the case for this carp-jumping little scholar Huang Gate, who actually had diarrhea during one morning court session, almost suffocating to death. Fortunately, Huang Gate wasn't like the fourth-rank and lower officials, who could only kneel outside the palace, unable to enter the palace to meet the emperor. His Majesty saw through this abnormality and specially allowed him to leave. Only then did he not become a huge laughingstock. As a result, this Huang Gate, who relied on selling his acquaintance with several great figures with great difficulty, completely became the capital's pre-tea and post-meal topic of ridicule. This was especially the case after Huan Wen led the Imperial College's left chancellor to Guangling Road to take on the role of administrator. In the entire capital, the only fourth-rank and above official who was willing to let Jean Lanting enter the palace was also gone. Who told this brat to just have to be so close to Bailiang? Jean Lanting, who smugly entered the capital with the status of being a replacement for the Great Yellow Gate, had long lost his initial scholarly spirit, his edges and corners polished. He also no longer cared about the earth-shattering mockery and ridicule. He clearly remembered those jealous and envious gazes the day after he was invited by Chancellor Huan to attend the court session. Jean Lanting stretched out a hand outside the umbrella. Raindrops hit the center of his palm, causing him to feel a burst of pain. He, who had been using the oil paper umbrella to cover his face all this time, slightly opened the umbrella and looked at those officials of all kinds who were gathered together like a small mountain. Listening to them talk and laugh wittily, this familiar Xian Lang, who was collectively rejected by the capital's officials, lightly tiptoed. Because of his noble status, the court had to strictly follow the order of rank and enter in a single file. He was able to approach the main gate of the imperial city. Thus, Jean Lanting saw a few conspicuous umbrellas. One of them was Grand Secretary Zhang Julu, whose figure was several inches taller than a normal person's umbrella. Under the umbrella, other than this important figure who was a pillar of strength for 300 years, there was also Sun Shiji, the left servant of the province of Menxia who could not attend court but insisted on attending court. It was probably because the Grand Secretary was worried about old servant Sun's health that he helped hold the umbrella to block the rain. This was a great honor, not at all inferior to the emperor's permission for old servant Sun to sit in court. Jean Lanting withdrew his ice-cold hand. He lowered his eyelids and clenched his fists. He quietly looked not far away at another official who was also from Bailiang, the Assistant Minister of Rights, Yan Jieshi, who was a relative of the emperor. The governor of Bailiang's Lingzhou also happened to look over. Their gazes met and then bounced away. Jean Lanting withdrew his gaze without leaving a trace. He took a deep breath, his gaze firm and resolute. He wanted to be an official who spoke out. The treacherous official who was about to be impeached by him today was precisely the king of Bailiang, Su Xiao, who had helped him enter the capital to become an official. He knew that after morning court, regardless of whether the rain stopped or not, he would shake the court and his reputation would spread throughout the world. At this time, Su Fengnian had turned into Orange Prefecture. Chapter 499. Su Fengnian figured out a principle. The so-called when you draw your sword, you look around and feel at a loss. In addition to worrying about the country and the people, there was another possibility, which was to get lost. Because he had changed the fixed route, he could only follow the general direction like a headless fly. Fortunately, he met a group of scholars who were being cut off by horse gangs on the way. He helped them without drawing his sword, and then they turned to the border between Dragon Waste State and Orange State. The reason why he helped them was that he recognized the identity of these people as the descendants of the spring and autumn annals. Moreover, the horse gangs were not unfamiliar to him. Two of them were the ones who wanted to kidnap people back to warm the bed for the female head of the family. This group of scholars of different ages should be from good families. It was not known whether the family hired a guard instructor or hired 5 or 6 strong warriors, But they were not powerless against more than 30 horse gangs who came and went like the wind. Several men with swords also performed quite well. Although their swordsmanship was fancy, it was more than enough to frighten the horse gangs. Several young women dressed in men's clothes looked at them with shining eyes. However, Su Fengnian, who had done the most to make the final decision, made them lose interest. This was probably because he was wearing a mediocre face. Most of the love in the world was literary and focused on the feeling of love at first sight. But in the end, how could a man not be handsome or full of scholarly aura that was suffocating to the nose when he was the main character in a novel about a scholar and a beauty? How could a woman not be able to captivate the birds and beasts, obscure the moon and put flowers to shame? Su Fengnian did not feel any disappointment about this. On the contrary, he got along well with a few old Confucian scholars in the group. Only then did he find out that this group of people were the children of a few clans in Gusai state that had been connected for generations. The sage's teachings required one to read 10,000 books and travel 10,000 li. There were a few people in the group who had reached the age of 20 at the same time. Coincidentally, one of the old scholars had a marriage alliance with a big clan in Tangerine State. He also wanted to see the scenery of the frontier fortress, so they traveled together. The young people took advantage of their prime to study, while the old ones took advantage of the fact that one of their feet was still outside the coffin to travel quickly. As for the three women, they were all scholars who had reached the age of 20. Although they were also the descendants of the people who had fled to the north, after they were infected with the atmosphere of Beimang, they mustered up their courage to elope. Su Fengnian pondered for a moment, and knew that most of the families they belonged to were slightly inferior to the few young scholars. They hoped that they could take advantage of the opportunity during their travels and climb up the social ladder, so he turned a blind eye to it. Su Fengnian's small talk with Tian Nan and Di Bei also confirmed that there were 4 classes of people in Beimang. The remnants of the spring and autumn period were all in the second class. Later on, the Empress of Beimang, Jingjiu Lu, and the Qing dynasty changed the surname to determine the rank. Other than the fact that everyone in the court was well aware that they were paving the way for the Murong family, they were not completely without merit. In the southern dynasty, other than the 3 surnames Gao and Hua, the next so-called high-ranking families were mostly Bing and Ding. The old Confucian scholar who had a close relationship with Su Fengnian was able to join the Ding family because his clan brother had once served as the official minister of the southern dynasty's Ministry of Personnel. As for the leader of the group, although he was only from a third-class noble family in the Central Plains when he fled to the north, he had taken root in Beimang. Perhaps because the land and the land were suitable, 2 people from his family had been ranked high in the southern dynasty's 9 ministers. Along the way, they learned that this young man with the surname Su and given name Qi was just a concubine's son from Gusai Prefecture. They didn't even want to give him a smile, as if they were afraid that if they talked to him, young Master Luo would treat them as a frivolous and superficial woman. There was still a day's journey before they reached the border city of Orange State. In the dusk, the group of more than 20 people began to camp and rest. Su Fengnian nimbly helped several old Confucian scholars to set up sheepskin tents. In the eyes of some snobbish people, they were less interested in making friends with him. Only a few retainers who had almost died in the hands of the horse gang occasionally struck up a conversation with him, who was said to be half a soldier and half a merchant. The south-central part of Beimang was located in the north. It was easy to have fertile water and grass. There were also continuous mountains near Jinsi state of the Liang dynasty. However, they did not dare to cross the border too far. If they encountered the nobles of the northern dynasty, whether they were from the grassland or from the army, they might not even be able to return to Gusai state alive, let alone be rebuffed. After roughly setting up camp, they began to roast meat over a bonfire and warm up the wine and tea. Yesterday, a retainer with excellent archery had killed a wild horse and a few swans. Before they finished eating, Su Fengnian had only tasted a few bites of half-cooked horse meat thanks to several old Confucian scholars. Sitting in front of the bonfire, the young scholars talked loudly as if one exhaled to save the country and the people, and one inhaled to save the world. The old scholars reminisced about the time when they were young in the Central Plains. For some reason, the topic focused on the military strength of the 2 dynasties and then the arm strength of the crossbow. The old man surnamed Luo of the Ding family saw that Su Fengnian seemed to be engrossed in the conversation, so he explained with a smile, "The strength of the crossbow, or the so-called bow strength, is the method of hanging a heavy object upside down until it is fully drawn. The weight of the object is the same as the weight of the bow. There is also a relatively rare rod and scale hook, which is more accurate and is usually used in the military camp. This old man's retainer who pulled the bow and shot down the swan has the arm strength of nearly 2 stones. I dare not say that he can shoot through a willow leaf in 100 steps, but he can shoot through 1 or 2 pieces of leather armor at about 80 steps. The bow he used is of the best quality in the winter. The buffalo horn and the elk tendon are also good materials for making bows. It's a pity that fish gelatin and silk are not good enough. Otherwise the bow he carried could be sold for at least 300 taels of silver. Chapter 500. Su Fengnian said with a smile, Mr. Luo, if that's the case, then that bow should be able to draw at least 300 gene of force, right? Old scholar Luo stroked his beard and said with a smile, That's right, but 300 gene of force is something that only a brave general on the battlefield can draw. If he could, then he wouldn't be this old man's retainer. Xueqi, can you guess that this person was a Bailiang army crossbowman when he was young? Su Fengnian glanced at the silent man wiping the bow and shook his head. I really can't guess. Perhaps it was because the handsome men and beauties next to the bonfire heard the words Bailiang army and became interested in the conversation. They began to talk about the generals in the Bailiang army. Some said that Chen Jibao's spear technique was invincible, while others said that Yuan Zuozong was the true number 1 in terms of combat strength. There were even some who said that Rentu should be at least first rank, or else how could he have obtained the king of Bailiang's boa robe when he joined the army at the age of 10? There was no end to this debate. Most of the handsome young men believed that Su Xiao was shrewd and had always hidden his strength on the battlefield. It was impossible for him to be a 2nd or 3rd rank martial artist. 2nd rank master was indeed outstanding, but for a great general whose achievements were almost enough to shock the emperor, it was unavoidable that he couldn't bring it out. The old scholar saw that Su Fengnian didn't say anything and asked with a smile, Xueqi, what do you think? Su Fengnian wiped the grease from the roasted meat at the corner of his mouth. I think Su Xiao is at most 2nd rank. It's only because of his good luck that he was able to leave the battlefield alive. I heard that after he became a general, the heavy snow camp that followed him always suffered the most casualties out of all the Bailiang army. A young man who admired Su Fengnian had sharp ears and was about to throw a branch into the bonfire, but it hit the ground at Su Fengnian's feet. He sneered, Small fish and shrimp in a small pond, don't talk nonsense if you don't know anything. Su Fengnian nodded with a smile and said, Good. Old scholar Luo quickly warmed the atmosphere with a smile. Everyone has their own opinions. Right now, we're thousands of miles away from home, and no one speaks for themselves. The young men and women were clearly much more respectful towards this elder who had walked out of the Ding family. A few of the talented youths who had wanted to seize the opportunity to make things difficult swallowed their words back into their stomachs along with the roasted meat. Although the 2nd-generation descendants of the spring and autumn survivors who had migrated to Beimang weren't as disdainful as the Central Plains, they lived under someone else's roof in Beimang and didn't dare to blindly look down on martial artists. However, their families' teachings were still closely related to many of their habits. For example, the heir of the Luo family, who had the reputation of being a scholar and a sword scholar, was still more scholarly than swordsmanship. This was especially true for the one called Xueqi, who was only from a low-class noble family in Gusai Prefecture. Naturally, he couldn't study literature well, so he took a step back and studied martial arts, hoping to climb up the ranks of the border army and accumulate scholarly honors. Someone like him, who was neither high nor low, actually dared to talk about national and military affairs. The elegant heir of the Luo family pointed at a gentlewoman with a branch and laughed. Miss Su, don't you have a younger brother who admires that Bailiang and His Royal Highness the most? The woman who was playing with a jade pendant softly said, They're all jackals of the same tribe. They're all good-for-nothings who don't amount to anything. They only know how to lead evil servants around and bully the common people like dogs. It's just that the heir of Bailiang has a better family background. They're all the same type of trash. If he were to stand in front of me, I wouldn't even look at him. The 3 women seemed to have a harmonious relationship on the surface, but it was actually very interesting. The one surnamed Su only wanted to travel thousands of miles and unintentionally planted a willow in the shade, which made the heir of the Luo family somewhat moved. The other 2 women wanted to plant flowers, but the flowers didn't bloom. No matter how coquettishly they flirted and threw flirtatious glances, the heir of the Luo family only teased them with a few words and didn't give them any reassurance. The 2 ladies were extremely annoyed. If the one surnamed Su was present, they would have a common enemy. If the one surnamed Su was present, they would have a common enemy. If the one surnamed Su was present, they would have a common enemy. When one of them heard that the one surnamed Su was so pretentious, She couldn't help but laugh and said, "Sister Su, are you serious? Ah, you can't even fake your expression in front of Baelyang and His Royal Highness? Don't be so embarrassed that you can't even speak when you're in front of him. Little sister, I've heard that His Royal Highness is very handsome. Although he's a bit unrestrained when it comes to romantic affairs, he claims to be second, but no one dares to claim to be first." The woman surnamed Su smiled gracefully and didn't refute. The other woman with an oval face, who was more charming than elegant, was even more eccentric. "Sister Su, don't you like to appraise ancient paintings? Let's not talk about other things. Who in the world doesn't know that famous paintings that have been jokingly stamped with the word fake are all genuine? How many people have collected paintings that everyone regards as suspenseful, and thus have their names verified?" The woman surnamed Su smiled and said, "On this point, the heir of Baelyang has indeed contributed greatly. No gold is pure. Didn't young Master Luo also say that he's not proficient in the zither? But a hand has 5 fingers, and there's also a long one. This is precisely Baelyang and His Royal Highness." The two women were choked by her watertight explanation. They looked at each other in dismay, but they couldn't find any weakness that could be used against her. They were indignant and didn't say anything. Su Fengnian gazed at the gradually growing fire and smiled faintly. It felt pretty good to be mocked in front of his face. If he were in Baelyang, he wouldn't be so lucky. Su Fengnian couldn't help but think of Li Yishan, who had never admitted to being his master. He also somewhat missed the painful feather duster that Li Yishan used to hit his palm when he was young. This feather duster was still on the top floor of the Tide Listening Pavilion. A lot of principles had been developed in this way. He didn't know why, but when he was scolded by Su Xiao in his immature childhood and youth, he felt wronged and ran off to the mausoleum in a fit of pique. On the contrary, he was beaten by Li Yishan and never held a grudge. This time when he returned to Baelyang, he had to bring him a few jugs of good wine. Chapter 501. The sun was setting in the west and the afterglow was mild. Young Master Luo held a wine pot in his hand and spoke a stream of witty words as he chatted. He talked about how he did not consider the pros and cons in the face of righteousness, and how he did not see defeat in the eyes of others. He talked about how common people would be relieved when they saw that there was nothing in front of them, but they did not know that Kung Fu was only an accident. Even Su Fengnian, an outsider, listened with great interest and felt that his tackiness had suddenly lessened. Not to mention the two young ladies who were already secretly in love with young Master Luo. They wished that they could snuggle up to him or simply go to the bed and listen to his teachings. Several old scholars also nodded their heads repeatedly. It was obvious that they had a good impression of this Luo family disciple, not just because he was surnamed Luo. Just like when they met the horse thieves, this person pulled out his sword to fight off the enemy before his retainers. What an outstanding and elegant scholar. He would definitely not be a promising future. With young Master Luo acting as the go-between, the atmosphere was warm. A gifted scholar improvised a poem while the woman surnamed Su played the bamboo flute leisurely. The rest of the young men and women either clapped their hands in agreement or beat the dried twigs to make light drums. It was a joyous and harmonious atmosphere. Old Scholar Luo, who was wearing a scholar's green robe and a jade hanging from his waist, looked into the distance and sighed with emotion. How big of a mind can a frog at the bottom of a well look at the sky at the mouth of the well? Looking into the distance, the world is vast and the heart's eye is also opened. So you young people should take advantage of your better health to go out and walk around. I followed my family to the north and along the way there was chaos and turmoil. I was displaced and became a common person. Only then did I understand the suffering and difficulties of the common people. So when we arrived at Baymang, I think that our group of old scholars on the whole is much less romantic and more humane than those scholars who stayed in the Central Plains. Our children also lack the unsuitable loftiness of many scholars. Su Fengnian twisted his 2 fingers and gently broke off a dried twig. He threw it into the bonfire and nodded with a smile. Old Master Luo's words are very reasonable. The old scholar, whose family background was one of the best in the southern dynasties of Baymang, withdrew his gaze and looked at the good-tempered young man. He laughed in a low voice. Little brother Su, Luo Chongha and the other scholars, although they are rude and don't have a good expression, in fact, they don't have any bad feelings towards you. It's just that when they met the horse thieves, an outsider who took the limelight, they were unable to turn around and put their faces down. I've been through this. When I was young of jealousy, I was too jealous of them. It's fate that brought us together. When we return to Gusai State in the future, if you encounter any difficulties, I can guarantee that they will definitely say a few words for you if they bump into you. But most likely, they won't show up and tell you that it was I who helped you. Su Fengnian nodded. Although the old scholar beside him was a noble and famous scholar, he was willing to hang out with him, a son of a concubine from a family that was not worth mentioning. This was enough to explain a lot of things. This old man was experienced in the ways of the world and was familiar with people's hearts. What he said was the truth with reason and evidence. The old scholar laughed. He rummaged around and finally found a clean porcelain bowl from his bag. He handed it to Su Fengnian and asked, "We just met by chance. Can we have a drink?" Su Fengnian squinted his eyes and smiled. "1 cup is too little. As long as there is enough wine, a few bowls will do." The old scholar pretended to protect the deerskin wine bag that was only half empty. He pretended to be angry and said, "I can't drink more than a few bowls." Su Fengnian smiled helplessly and said, "When we arrive in the city tomorrow, I'll just give you a good bag of wine." 2 old men who were 5 or 6 years younger than old scholar Luo took advantage of the situation and laughed heartily. "Little brother, you can't favor one and discriminate against the other." "That's reasonable," Su Fengnian promised and agreed. He didn't know when the custom of composing a poem after drinking a bowl of wine had been established. After a round of drinking, even Su Fengnian's side could not escape. Even the 5 or 6 retainers sitting around the bonfire also coyly spouted out a few vulgar slang words. They couldn't be counted as 5 or 7 words, but when they came from the mouths of men, there was a bit of a rough frontier atmosphere. It couldn't be said that they were deliberately trying to embarrass Su Fengnian, an outsider. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, it was Su Fengnian's turn. The old scholar surnamed Luo helped pour a bowl of wine and reminded him with a smile, "You can't talk about the palace and ruin the mood by composing a poem. You also can't recite the poems of the great poets. As long as it's your own, you can just make it up." Su Fengnian didn't know why, but he remembered several waterfalls on Mount Hui and Mount Jiuhua in Wudong, as well as watching the tide by the Guangling River. He remembered many old friends and stories. He downed a bowl of strong wine in 1 gulp. He asked for a chopstick and lightly tapped the edge of the bowl. With a ding-dong sound, he looked at the bonfire and said softly, "The waterfall of the lotus is covered in smoke, the waterfall of the bull is thunderous. Only the waterfall of Jiuhua is not strange in the waterfall's spine, like a celestial being lying sideways on a large mound. Its power can stretch out 94,000 feet, like the flying immortal of Dunhuang, releasing the 9 paths of the green sky Milky Way, just like the old general's hair on his temples." The young men and women who thought this guy was going to make a fool of himself were stunned for a moment and then looked at each other. Most of them were familiar with poetry and books and knew that this was just the beginning. Luo Changhe and the woman surnamed Su both frowned and thought carefully about the meaning. The old scholars besides Su Fengnian didn't think so much, but old scholar Luo followed the boy's example. He lightly slapped his thigh and drank a mouthful of wine with narrowed eyes. "I came at the time of splashing ink and rain. The 2 cliffs were tight and the wind was furious. The cloud waves rose and surged 10,000 feet. The flood washed away the traveler's path. I once watched the tide and the waterfall. Under the waterfall stood a white deer. In a split second, man and deer looked at each other. Southern Tang, Eastern Yu, or Western Shu. After that, there was an old monk leading the deer away, and then there was the deer turning around and laughing. When I finished speaking, the moon set in the west. The mountains and waters were boundless. I only felt the smoke under the stone bridge. The thunder rumbled, carrying the spring and autumn wind and the bitter rain, mighty and mighty like the river." This poem that had just been blurted out was probably too unconventional, making it impossible for people to comment on its quality. They only felt that there was air in their chests that couldn't be released, like the 1,000-layer waterfall pouring down and piling up and echoing in the deep pool. Finally, a scholar couldn't help but say softly, "Is this a poem or a poem? It's neither a donkey nor a horse. It's not particular at all." Another scholar asked carefully, "There's no physique at all, but there's still some meaning, right?" Perhaps old Master Luo was holding the bowl unsteadily. Some wine splashed on his hand. He unconsciously stroked his beard, wetting his gray beard. He didn't care about these details. He and the other 2 old scholars looked at each other and smiled. Their eyes were full of sincere appreciation. After returning from 3 years of traveling, he asked for a bowl of wine at the wine shop at the city gate. He told the waiter to serve the wine and then fell asleep. Later on, he carried the bowl and walked in the martial emperor city, And today, under the night sky of the prairie, he knocked the bowl and sang softly. Su Fengnian felt as if a lifetime had passed. He was in a daze, lost in thought, and didn't hear the words of those young masters and misses. The short saber springtime thunder lying quietly on his lap was trembling incessantly. He didn't know if the old man wearing the sheepskin fur coat was referring to this concept when he said that in the scabbard, one cry would soar to the ninth heaven. The old Confucian scholar seemed to want to make a judgment. He laughed in a deep voice and said, "I write with my hand, I speak with my mouth, I think with my mouth. How can I be bound by the poems of the predecessors?" Xiao Xiongdi, do you have a name for your poem? Su Fengnian came back to his senses and blushed with shame. He said, "I came up with an idea on the spur of the moment, I don't have one yet." An old scholar drank a mouthful of wine and smacked his lips. He sighed and said, "Why don't you call it the waterfall breathing song? It can teach our generation scribes, who are like flies and dogs, to also produce a few pounds of awe-inspiring righteousness." Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "The name is too big, I really don't dare to accept it." The other bonfires felt a little awkward and left one after another. They either went for a walk under the moon or went back to their tents to rest. Only Luo Changhe and the woman surnamed Su stood up and sat down. Luo Changhe laughed softly and said, "Young Master Su's breadth of mind is as wide as the hills and valleys. I admit that I'm not as good as you.